Part 2, 6. The Inspector. Once Tress made the decision, a knot came undone within her, like she'd finally worked a tangle out of a stubborn lock of hair. She would do it. She had no idea how, but she would find a way to get off the island, cross the terrible Crimson Sea, enter the Midnight Sea, and rescue Charlie. Yes, each of those problems seemed equally impossible, but somehow less impossible than imagining the rest of her life without him. First, though, Tress went to talk to her parents, something more people in stories such as this should do. She sat them both down, then explained her love for Charlie, her realization that no one would help him, and her determination to go find him, though she expressed worry that her absence might cause them hardship. Both listened quietly as she spoke. This was in part because she'd baked them quail-egg pies. It's more difficult to object to your daughter's temporary insanity when your mouth is full. Once she'd finished, Lem asked for seconds. It was a two-pie type of predicament. Alba only finished half of her meal, sitting back and leaving the rest untouched. It was also a half-pie type of predicament. Tress's father ate his second pie with deliberate care, digging down from the top, then eating outward, saving the crust for the end. Finally, he crunched through that. Then he stared at the plate for a long, uncomfortable moment. Was it perhaps a three-pie predicament? "I think," he said at last, turning to Alba, "we're going to have to let her do this." "It's lunacy," Tress's mother said. "Leave the island? Travel to the Midnight Sea? Steal a prisoner from the sorceress?" Lem felt at his mustache bristles with his napkin, cleaning out remnants of the meal. "Alba, would you say our daughter is more practical than we are?" "Yes, I would normally say that," Alba said. "And would you also say she is more thoughtful than we are?" "She is always thinking," Tress's mother agreed. "How often does she impose upon people or ask for what she wants?" "Almost never." "With all that in mind," Tress's father said, "it must be the right decision for her to leave. She will have considered all other options. Leaving the island to rescue the man she loves might sound like lunacy, but if every other option has been discarded as impossible, then insanity might, in this case, be practical." Tress felt a small thrill inside. He agreed? "Tress," her father said, leaning forward, resting his once powerful arms on the tabletop, "we can care for your brother and ourselves if you go. Please do not worry about us. You are too accommodating in this regard. But neither of us can go with you. You understand this?" "Yes, father," she said. "I had always wondered if this island would prove too small for one such as you." This made Tress frown. "Why do you act like that?" he asked her. "I don't want to be rude." "Then I demand you tell me, so that not speaking would be even more rude." Her grimace worsened. "Well, why would you say the island is too small for me, father? There's nothing extraordinary about me. If anything, I am too small for it." "Everything is extraordinary about you, Tress," her mother said. "That's why nothing in particular stands out." Well, parents have to say things like that. They're required to see the best in their children, otherwise living with the little sociopaths would drive a person mad. "I have your blessing, then?" Tress asked them. "I still think this is a terrible idea," Alba noted. Lem nodded. "It is. But a terrible idea, executed brilliantly, has to be better than a brilliant idea executed terribly. I mean, look at pelicans." "True," Tress's mother said. "But are we capable of either kind of brilliance?" "No," Tress said. but maybe we can take a whole lot of little steps that, when looked at together, might seem brilliant to somebody who doesn't know us." And so they set to work. Tress was keenly aware that Charlie might be suffering, but she resolved to take her time. If she was going to do something as stupid as leave the island, she figured she should be meticulous about it. Perhaps that would dilute the stupidity with time, like how good flour could dilute the stale and improve the bake. She took to knitting socks at the cliffside so she could watch the ships that came and left. Her mother began to make stockings at a table near the dock so she could take notes. They compared their findings each night, with Tress's father listening and offering his thoughts. Though Tress had always possessed a curiosity about the mechanics of shipping, she now had a motive to learn the details. There were two types of people who regularly left the island. The first was, of course, the crews of the various ships. When they landed, they'd come ashore to shop or visit the local taverns. The Rock didn't have much to recommend it, but Brick's Ale was known as some of the best in the region. Plus, with enough of it in you, the rest of the amenities looked a whole lot better. The second type of people who left the Rock were government officials. Not only the Duke and his family, but other royal administrators, such as tax collectors, royal messengers, and cargo inspectors. They were allowed to leave when they saw fit. Members of the nobility who visited could also leave, and they usually did so quickly after realizing their awful mistake. Tress's biggest challenge would be the current cargo inspector. The severe woman authenticated the writs of visiting merchants, then examined cargo for stowaways. For a place where no one wanted to live, the Rock certainly had lots of things people wanted. Salt from the mines, Brick's Ale, even down and feathers from the gulls. The townspeople couldn't sell these things except to ships that had a writ of commission from the king. The cargo inspector oversaw it all. When the current one had arrived earlier in the year, she'd refused to give her name, insisting they simply call her Inspector. She claimed she wouldn't be remaining on the Rock long enough for names to matter. Tress couldn't remember an inspector who had been more strict. This woman was always watching, swinging the rod she carried, searching for any excuse to deliver a punishment. She seemed too stern to be fully human, as if instead of being born, she'd been spawned, and instead of growing up, she'd metastasized. Tress and her mother spent hours covertly studying how the inspector searched outgoing shipments. Bags of feathers were weighed, while barrels of salt were stabbed to search for possible stowaways. But some things being shipped, like large kegs of the local brew, couldn't be opened without spoiling them. What if a person were to hide in a keg? Could they fill it with something like salt to make it weigh and balance correctly? Unfortunately, the inspector had an answer to such potential escape plans. When examining kegs, she employed a special listening device, like the ones physicians used for hearts. The inspector would linger on each keg, listening for someone moving or breathing inside. Reportedly, the inspector had extremely good hearing and could detect the very heartbeats of stowaways. Was there a way around this? A way to exploit the situation? One night, 2 weeks after she'd first decided to leave, Tress sat up with a notebook full of ideas. The emerald moon shone bright as always, stoic and immobile in the sky. Spores poured downward in the distance like crystalline moonlight. Her father limped over, settled down, then waved for her to show him her plans. He read them carefully, then nodded. "This could work." "It could," Tress said, yawning, "but I don't think it will. I might be able to fool a bunch of sailors, but I'd never fool Brick, Grimmy, or Sore. They will know that something is wrong." She rubbed her eyes. She'd been going without sleep, fraught as she was. Worry, it might be said, is the carrion feeder of emotions, drawn to other better emotions, like crows to a battlefield. "Perhaps you don't have to fool them," her father said. "Perhaps they would be willing to help." "I couldn't ask that of them," Tress said. What if the inspector catches me? The others would get into too much trouble." Her father nodded again. That was, of course, the sort of thing Tress would say. So he suggested she go to bed. Tress looked as if she were about to fall asleep in the middle of the conversation, which was saying something considering how many of Charlie's stories she'd survived without so much as a yawn. After she went upstairs, Lem retrieved his cane, put on his coat, and went out to do some advanced fathering. 7. The Father. Lem was not a poor man. Now, you might say to me, "Hoyd, this entire story has shown me the opposite. Lem's family is always scrimping to survive." And I would reply, "Please stop interrupting." Lem was not poor, he simply didn't have a lot of money. That night, as Tress slept, Lem limped down the long road to Brick's tavern. He knew for certain that Gremmy and Sore would be there. After all, the tavern didn't close until 2. Lem hobbled in. It was still early enough that the place was happy and boisterous. Evenings at the tavern, as you know, are like fires in a hearth. They live 2 lives. There's the part where they're roaring, festive, and cheerful. Then the evening begins to drift. The tavern becomes colder, darker, and quieter. Those who populate the tavern during its second life don't want companionship, just company. That was a few hours away, so Lem passed laughing miners sharing rounds and chatting about their boring. He spotted Gremmy and Sore together, as they often were. The dock worker and the dock master looked like opposite ends of a tack. Gremmy, with his squat body and flat head, had a haircut that said, "What's the cheapest?" Sore was ostensibly Gremmy's boss, but rarely brought the matter up in case it might accidentally sound like he was offering to pay the tab. He sat tall and straight and sipped at a beer because he didn't want to be seen drinking the wine that he could afford. Brick, of course, was behind the bar, standing on his stool to be at eye height to his patrons. Tress needed all 3 men's help, but Lem didn't approach any of them. Instead, he took up position near the dartboard. Jewel was playing, and offered Lem the next game, which he happily accepted. Lem threw the first dart several feet below the board, hitting the wood there on one of 2 knots that bore holes from a large number of darts. Jewel eyed it approvingly, and took his own throw, hitting near Lem's. "I heard," Lem said, taking his second throw, "you helped Gremmy with his tab again. Right nice of you, that was." Jewel nodded in appreciation. Next game was against old Rod, the innkeeper. Lem missed his first 2 throws, unfortunately. One was so off it hit the dartboard. The third hit far beneath it, though. "Nice," Rod said. "Does that cane help with your balance, Lem? I swear you've gotten better at darts since the accident." "Having a cane doesn't help with darts, Rod," Lem said. "Having nothing to do, though." Rod grunted. "You still help Brick with the brewing on weekends?" Lem asked. "More often than not," Rod said, and took his throws. After that, Rod moved off, making way for another game and another. As men came to play Lem, they read the unspoken script of his questions. They remembered that time when Rod had been drunk and Lem had helped him home, and Jewel, when he'd lost his roof during the windstorm, Lem had helped build a new one. There were dozens of similar stories. Lem was the human equivalent of a deep, pure well, always full of water when you needed it. He'd offer what you needed and ask nothing in return. In fact, he'd never bring it up again. Unless it was urgent. Unless it was important. In those cases, well, Lem might have been poor in the kind of currency that paid taxes, but he was downright wealthy when it came to the kind of currency that mattered. Word got around that night. Lem needed something, specifically from Gremmy, Sore, and Brick. Lem, the man with no debt, needed this favor so badly he almost asked for it. In the language of men like these, that's the equivalent of begging. Lem continued playing darts and scored quite well. If you're wondering at the odd targets they used, it should be noted that one evening a couple years earlier, someone had noticed that a group of knots high on the wall looked an awful lot like a face. The Duke's face, in fact, if you imagined the grain of that wood as his hair and the dartboard as the family insignia on his chest. And, well, somewhere below that were two prominent knots in the wall, right above where the legs would have been. Lem threw, and nearby men winced. "Nice," one noted. As the night progressed, quiet, invisible ledgers were tallied. Decisions were reached, but not spoken. They didn't need to be, for the next morning, too early for any of them, Tress found the barkeep, the dockmaster, and the dock worker on her doorstep. They demanded to help her in whatever she was doing. So it was that a little over a week later a large keg was deposited on the dock for inspection. Gremmy pushed it up alongside 5 others. The perfect ship had arrived for executing Tress's plan, a vessel known as the 2+3MP4 Dream. It needed to be a ship with a crew that didn't often visit Diggins Point, and it needed a king's writ authorizing the purchase of Brick's ale. The sailors of the 2+3MP4 Dream nearly took the kegs on board without inspection, but the captain had read the terms of his writ. "There's supposed to be an inspection, is there not?" he demanded. "We cannot leave port until it has been done." So the inspector was summoned. She arrived with a scowl that could have killed spores, her rod held at the ready to deal out justice. She examined the first keg, then used her listening device on it. Nearby, Soar peered at his pocket watch, counting the seconds, his heart thumping. Gremmy mopped his head as the inspector moved down the line of kegs. Brick nudged him, trying to urge him to not look so suspicious. Finally, the inspector listened to the last large keg. Just big enough for a girl to curl up inside, it was. The inspector listened closely and found nothing. She waited for the cargo to be loaded. The 3 conspirators exchanged glances, until the inspector paused and turned back. Then, in a sudden motion, she kicked over the last keg. It went thump. Then it went ouch. "I thought so," the inspector said, grabbing a crowbar from the dock, then prying the keg's top free to reveal the truth. A raven-haired young woman hiding inside, trying to sneak off the island. "Feathers as insulation!" the inspector cried. "You thought that would muffle the sounds enough to fool my ear?" Well, after that, things went downhill at speed. "This couldn't have been managed without help," the inspector snapped at the dockmaster. "This couldn't have been managed without a conspiracy!" Poor Gremmy couldn't take it and started bawling right there. Brick tried to quiet him, while Soar wondered out loud if maybe he could order Gremmy to take his punishment for him. "The king has worried about your disloyalty," the inspector said with a sneer. "He warned me about the people of this town. He will be told of this, that you all worked together to circumvent his laws. Pay for only 5 kegs, Captain." The other 5 kegs were loaded onto the ship, and the ship took off toward the Emerald Sea's core archipelago to deliver the ale. The inspector went with them, leaving her assistant to watch the docks, declaring she would tell the king personally of the betrayal at Diggins Point. Now, you might have noticed that the young woman in the barrel was not Tress, and you might think she was actually in one of the other kegs. She was not. Tress was not hiding in some other piece of cargo. Tress was not hiding at all. Tress was the inspector. 8. The Stowaway. Tress thought she could see the real inspector arriving on the docks in the distance, a tiny, irate figure who gestured in anger at the fleeing ship. She would be told that the captain had insisted on leaving without inspection. By now, Gret, the dockmaster's daughter, would have climbed out of the hollow keg and left. There would be no other witnesses left on the rock except for Brick, Grimmy, and Sore, whose debts had now been paid. Just like that, Tress was free. This time, Diggin's Point was the thing that grew smaller and smaller in the distance. Practically everything and everyone that Tress had ever known lived on that island, and soon she wouldn't even be able to see it. Leaving didn't feel exciting. It felt heavy. Every child looked forward to the day when they could choose a different path from the one their parents were on. Tress sincerely hoped she hadn't decided on one that led straight off a cliff. But she was free. She'd escaped without a hitch. She wondered if maybe her other tasks would be accomplished with similar ease. She could wonder this because, lacking formal training in the arts, Tress had no concept of dramatic irony. She turned her gaze to the sky. It was so blue out here, away from the mining smog. That felt immoral somehow, as if she were seeing the sky without its clothing. The air smelled not of salt anymore, but pure and clean. And dangerous. No salt meant free spores. Fortunately, the deck's railing was lined with silver, and surely people wouldn't travel the Emerald Sea if it weren't reasonably safe. The ship's sails billowed and shook as the vessel turned, sailors calling to one another as they worked. They'd been forced to take her. The king's writs of purchase obligated captains to ferry government officials who required passage away from the rock. So the crew left Tress alone as she stood at the back of the ship on the quarterdeck, near the wheel where the captain chatted with the helmsman. Tress wore an inspector's uniform with a bright red and gold coat going down past her knees. They'd stolen it the night before. It was the spare one from the inspector's closet. Tress's mother had altered it perfectly to appear as if it had been made for Tress. And, of course, a mistake on the dock register in the inspector's room had indicated the wrong time for the Oots Dream to leave the rock, so she'd shown up late. The only things Tress had brought with her were a small bundle of clothing and a bag of cups. Her favorite among them was the 4th cup that Charlie had sent, the one with the butterfly on it. Something about the simple design struck her. She was glad the sailors ignored her because it was difficult to cover up how much she gawked at the green spore ocean. Tress wasn't aware of the science of what made the ship float, but it's actually rather interesting. Vents, deep below on the ocean floor, sent up bursts of air. With this agitation, the spores became as liquid. The phenomenon is possible on any world, including your own. Fluidization, it's called. Pump air up underneath a box of sand, and you'll see something similar to what Tress was watching. Bubbles burst from the spores all around, making the ocean churn and undulate. It slapped the ship's hull and flowed away, splashing, making waves. It wasn't quite like water. It was too thick, and the tips of the waves broke apart into puffs of green spores. In fact, the sea was wrong in the way that solely something almost right can be. Familiar, yet alien. As if it were liquid's disrespectful cousin who told inappropriate jokes at Grandma's funeral. The ship sailed like any ship would on water, but it could move only as long as the air bubbled up from below. The people on Tress's world called this phenomenon the seethe. It came and went randomly, fluidizing entire oceans for days at a time. Periodically it would cease, stranding all the ships sailing upon it. Interruptions were usually short, but occasionally lasted hours or even days. A wave broke high against the side of the ship, tossing up a burst of spores. Tress cried out despite herself and backed away, but the spores turned gray, dying. "Haven't sailed much, eh?" the captain asked from nearby. He had terrible breath, a crispy tan complexion, and stringy, matted hair. Imagine him as the answer to the question, what if that gunk from your shower drain were to come to life? Still, he was the best option Tress had found in her weeks of watching, so she wasn't going to complain, even if he did laugh at her again the next time the spores surged. "We have silver enough," the captain said, waving toward the trim on the railing and built into the wood of the deck. A line of it ran up the mast. "Kills any spores that come too close, Inspector. You're safe." Tress nodded, trying to look as if she didn't care. But she kept her coat buttoned up tight and found herself breathing shallowly and wishing for a salted mask. Instead, she brought out her notebook and worked on her plan. She'd made it off the island. Next, she needed only to wait. The vessel would deliver her to the King's Island in the Core Archipelago. From there, Tress had to find her way into the palace so she could get a copy of Charlie's ransom note. That would be the easiest way to free him. Yes, paying off a ransom herself would be next to impossible, but it did seem easier than sneaking across the midnight sea to confront the sorceress. Hopefully, if she could find a way to pay, or persuade the king to pay, Charlie would be delivered to her safe. The deck creaked as the captain stepped nearer. "You have beautiful hair, Inspector," he said. "The color of a good cup of mead." Tress snapped her book closed. "Perhaps I will retire to my cabin now." He smiled. The man was exactly the sort of person who thought every woman in the room was thinking about him. Which they were, as each desperately hoped he would head the other direction. He waved for Tress to join him in walking down from the quarterdeck toward the cabins below it. Thankfully, the captain left her without needing to be ordered. The room was small, but private, and the door locked. Tress felt a great deal better once she was safe inside. She poured some water into her butterfly cup and settled onto the bunk to think. It all felt so much more real now. Was she really doing this? Had she really left her home? What were those strange, colorful pigeons, and why were they talking to her? This last part was a side effect of the poison the captain had ordered put in Tress's drink. There are, unfortunately, no talking pigeons in this story. Merely talking rats. 9. The Rat. Tress awoke. That was nice. Tress very much approved of not dying on the first day of her adventure. However, she had a pounding headache, and all she could see was blackness. Did one see blackness, or was it the mark of not seeing? Can you hear silence, taste nothing? Well, judging by the creaking of the wood, she was in the ship's hold. She groaned and sat up, then felt around. Her fingers met bars. She was in a cage. "You won't find a way out," said a quiet voice. It sounded male, but had a pinched quality to it, like someone had taken the speaker's words and was squeezing out the juice. "Who are you?" Tress asked softly. "A fellow prisoner. I heard them talking about you. You're an inspector?" "Yes," Tress lied. "For the king. I can't believe they'd dare assault me." On the inside, Tress was panicking. The captain must have figured out her ruse. The ship would be returning to Diggins Point to find the real inspector, and everything would fall apart. No, it had already fallen apart. She sat down, her back to some bars. "Lunatic choice you made, Inspector," the voice said. "You boarded the ship alone? How did you think this would play out? Were you planning to take them all on your own?" "Take them?" Tress asked. "Where?" "You don't know?" In case you're new to this, nothing good ever follows a question like that. "This is a smuggler's vessel," the voice explained. "They forged mercantile writs from the king. It lets them buy and sell goods without paying tariffs." Tress groaned, thumping her head against the bars. "And they thought I was suspicious of them. They thought that's why I got on their ship." "It wasn't?" the voice said, then started laughing. Or rather, Tress thought it was laughter. It came out as a high-pitched series of squeaks, like the sound of a hyperventilating donkey. "It was completely coincidental. Oh, you poor woman." Tress folded her arms tight in the darkness, suffering the mockery. At least she wasn't going to be taken back to Diggins Point to be turned in to the Duke. Instead, the smugglers would undoubtedly murder her and dispose of the body. She decided not to cry. Crying would be utterly impractical. So it was settled. Absolutely no crying. Her eyes vetoed the resolution.
"Hey," the voice said. "Hey, it's all right. At least you got off the rock, right?"
"You know about the rock?" Tress asked, wiping her eyes. Stupid things. Probably just wanted something to do with the not seeing and all.
"I was on my way there for a visit," the voice said, "before the sailors found me out. Locked me in here."
"Why would you visit Diggins Point?" Tress demanded.
"I have my reasons," the voice said. "My kind are mysterious like that."
"Your kind?" Tress asked.
"Here, let me show you. Might want to shade your eyes."
A moment later, light poured into the chamber, spilling from a small hole in the hull. Tress blinked, pushing her frazzled hair out of her eyes as she made out her surroundings. She was in a cell built into part of the ship's hold, maybe 4 feet on each side and not much taller. Across from her, lashed on top of some boxes, was a much smaller cage. In it sat a common black rat. He'd pulled a cork from the hole with his little paws.
"I keep this thing plugged," he said, "so they don't know about it. Don't want them to move the cage, you know.
The rat trailed off as he turned and saw her for the first time, then cocked his head. "What?" Tress asked. The rat was silent. The only sounds came from the ship rocking in the spores and the boots thumping on the deck above. Tress pulled back. She didn't like the way the rat stared at her with those beady little eyes. "What?" she demanded.
"Didn't get a good look at you when they brought you down. I didn't expect you to be so young. You're no royal inspector."
"I have a young face."
"I'm sure," the rat said.
He moved to the edge of his cage and sat on his haunches, leaning forward, tiny paws together. It was a very rat-like pose, which Tress supposed made sense.
"You're sneaking off the island," he said. "Why under the moons would you do that?"
"I told you," Tress snapped. "Nobody wants to be on Diggins Point. Anyway, the sailors bought my act, so you don't need to keep staring at me like that. My escape plan worked."
"Save for the whole accidentally frightening a bunch of smugglers part, I assume."
Tress wiped her eyes once more. "Can we maybe backtrack on this conversation? It looks like we missed the main roadway. I don't mean to be rude, but you are a rat."
"Seems self-evident."
"But you're talking."
"Again, self-evident."
"Yes, but how?"
"With my mouth,"
he said.
"Also reference my previous answer."
She bit her lip. It was a testament to her state of mind that she'd pushed him that far already. Was asking a talking rat why he could talk impolite? She probably would have been offended if someone had asked her why she could talk. The rat moved to pick up the cork.
"There's a story behind how I can talk, I suppose. It's not one I'm interested in telling."
"Huh," Tress said.
"What?"
"It's just, I'm not used to people saying things like that." The rat nibbled a bit on the cork, then moved it toward the hole. "Could you leave the hole open?" Tress asked. "A little longer?" The rat sighed as he nearly had the cork positioned, but he lowered it to the cage floor again. The boots up above were stomping around quickly. Perhaps they were changing course? "So, smugglers?" Tress said.
"Smugglers," the rat agreed, sniffing the air. "Got caught chewing on their rations and had to either give up my secret and talk or get tossed overboard as a pest. Turns out they think a talking rat might be worth something. I considered warning them I didn't have anything interesting to say, then thought it unwise to give them reason to doubt my value."
The rat gnawed more on the cork.
"Because of the impending war, every second captain is a smuggler these days. So you shouldn't feel too bad for falling in with some."
"The war?" Tress asked.
"With the sorceress," the rat said. "She's been sending more ships in to raid, and the king has been building up his forces, commandeering merchant vessels like a child reaching for treats. Seeing how easily you can find yourself conscripted these days, it's no wonder so many sailors are having a bout of prolapsed morals, so to speak." "Do you think I could deal with them?" Tress said. "Explain that I'm not actually an inspector?" "Oh, suddenly you aren't?" "I'm whatever gets me out of this cage. A friend of mine is in trouble, and I need to rescue him." "Him?" the rat said. "You left your home for a man?" Tress remained silent. "Hun, no man is worth getting killed over," the rat said. "If you manage to escape, you should head on home to your rock." "He's not just any man," Tress said, and— She cut off as a loud pop sounded somewhere outside. Tress cocked her head. What an odd noise to hear out on the ocean. Whatever could it be? Fate answered her by sending a cannonball, priority delivery, right through the ship's hull. 10. The Sprouter. The cannonball crashed through the far wall and soared across the center of the hold. When it hit the opposite wall, it burst into shards of wet ceramic and what looked like metal beads. Those scattered to the floor, mixing with splinters of broken wood. The deck above clamored with the sounds of scrambling feet and screaming men. "What's happening?" Tress shouted toward the rat. He'd pulled back against the far corner of his cage, cringing and shivering. "We're being attacked!" "I mean," Tress said, "what can you see out there? Go look through your hole." Though the cannonball had left a rather large second hole, it wasn't close to Tress and didn't let her see much of the outside world. Unnervingly, each time the ship crossed a wave, the new hole sank low enough to let spores spill in. She could see those just fine. "I spot one other ship," the rat said. "Can't see a flag." "Pirates?" Tress asked. "Pirates shouldn't be firing, at least not without demanding surrender first," the rat said. "What's the good of sinking all your potential booty under an ocean of spores? Must be a royal ship who found out this lot were smugglers and decided to deal with them the civilized way." "Civilized?" Tress screamed as another shot sounded outside. This one appeared to miss, fortunately. "Takes a civilization to build a cannon. What, you think there are forests out there growing them spontaneously?" Each pop of the cannon made her wince, but the immediate danger was those spores. As the ship rocked, more and more of them flooded the hold, covering the floor, spreading toward her in a green pool. Some of the spores died, turning a dull gray, but the silver in the deck above was far enough away that many survived, inching closer to her cage each time the ship climbed a wave and tipped the floor in her direction. Though sometimes described as dust, ether spores are thicker, more like fine sand, so they don't float around in the air like dust does without a strong breeze. Tress pulled her shirt collar up over her mouth anyway, watching with terror. For the spores were rolling toward the fragments of the broken cannonball and the water it had sprayed all over the wall. In that moment, Tress was given a crash course in naval warfare upon the spore seas. Yes, the enemy could have used uninteresting metal cannonballs. Instead, they used ones designed to blast open and dump water, making each shot far more interesting, assuming you, like me, find creative deaths interesting. Some living spores finally touched the water. They grew in a flash. Imagine lightning, but made of vines. They burgeoned, sweeping around one another, almost instantly growing into a jagged pattern some 10 feet tall. Within moments, a snarl of vines, vaguely shaped like a tree, had grown in the hold, with vine roots cracking the wood underneath and vine branches pushing up to bow the deck above. Tress couldn't help imagining some of those spores growing in her mouth or nose. She got a few things wrong, but she understood the basics. In case you have a more limited imagination, it begins with a feeling like hands forcing your jaws apart. Then vines fill your throat, growing wherever they can find space, snaking down into your lungs. They knock loose teeth and drill up through your soft palate and into your sinuses. They don't usually reach your brain, though, so you get the pleasure of suffocating to death as you feel the vines rip your eyes out of their sockets. You're welcome. Fortunately for Tress, a sailor soon stumbled down the steps with a lantern, wearing a cloth mask and bearing some odd equipment. Among it was a strange device called a splint box, a device which, I happen to know by pure coincidence, is exactly the right size to carry a human head. The sailor held the splint box up beside the hole in the hull, then carefully poured a few drops of water in the top. A sheet of reddish-pink stone grew out the front of the box. Translucent, like cloudy crystal, the stone fused with the wood on the sides, plugging the hole. The sailor cut the sheet off the front of the box with a silver knife. Every ship on Tress's world had at least one sailor trained to handle and use spores, known as a sprouter. Tress watched in amazement. She'd heard of that substance, rosite. It grew from the pink-red spores of the Rose Sea, which bordered her own Emerald Sea. Unlike the Crimson Sea or the Midnight Sea, the Rose Sea was inhabited, which meant its spores weren't quite as deadly as others. Still, it seemed plenty dangerous to her. Growing vines in your mouth was bad enough. Crystals sounded even worse. Yet the sailor had casually used them to repair the ship, leaving the rosite on the whole like a bandage. You could use spores? For practical purposes? Just like that, Tress's lesson in naval warfare was shoved aside by a lesson in utilitarian economics. With the hole patched, the sprouter unslung the device he'd been carrying over his shoulder. It looked like a pole with a plate on the bottom end. When he waved it over the floor, the remaining green spores turned gray. The plate, Tress realized, had to be made of silver. He gave the vine growth a quick glance, but apparently decided it wouldn't do more harm for the moment, and so left it and walked toward the steps to the upper deck. "Wait!" Tress called to him, grabbing the bars at the front of her cage. "That has to be a royal ship out there, right? If it's firing on us rather than demanding ransom or surrender, they're here to exterminate some smugglers."
"Better hope they don't," the sailor said to her. "You'll go down with us, Inspector, or not."
He made a rude gesture toward her, which on their planet involved flipping his fingers in her direction, as if flinging water. "That's my exact point," Tress said. "If they knew there was a royal inspector on board, do you think they'd be so eager to fire on us?" The sprouter stared at her a long moment, then scrambled to grab the keys to her cell. 11. The Thief. The sight that confronted Tress as she emerged from the hold could have unnerved a dragon. The ship that had been firing on them was far closer than she'd expected, close enough that she could make out the sailors on the deck. The enemy ship had 2 cannons, one on the foredeck, one aft. Now, you might have heard stories of great sailing ships with a dozen or more guns on each side. They hadn't reached such heights on Tress's world. Many ships had only 1 cannon, and they kept them on swiveling platforms. Often a ship's crew had a cannon master in charge of aiming. The Oot's Dream had a single small cannon on the foredeck. At the moment, the smuggler ship was heeling hard as part of a weaving maneuver rather than firing. Tress didn't know sailing mechanics. She simply saw the enemy ship looming and watched with a slack jaw as their front cannon lobbed a shot toward the Oot's Dream. It hit the Spore Sea starboard amidships, and, unlike the cannonball that had broken through the hull earlier, this one smashed on first impact, releasing its cargo of water into the spores. A tree-like burst of vines exploded into existence inches away from Tress. More twisted than a librarian's love life, trust me, they're a strange bunch. It writhed with overlapping tendrils. It reminded Tress of her hair most mornings, before she got out her brush. The gnarled vines grabbed hold of the ship, latching onto its gunwale. The vines that strayed near Silver grayed and died, like spores did, but they held on tight nonetheless. It seemed this method of bombardment could rip a ship apart, silver or no silver. Either that or the vines would get a good hold and strand the ship in place, leaving it easy pickings. Tress was shoved aside as sailors with axes rushed over to attack the vines in an attempt to cut the ship free.
"That was too close," the captain said, shouting to the helmsman. "Keep weaving, Gustel."
He stood nearby, and Tress could, regrettably, smell his breath as he spun on the sailor who had pulled her up the steps.
"What under the moons are you doing with that woman, Dorp?"
"She's a royal inspector, Captain," Dorp said, gesturing to Tress. "I figured maybe if they saw her, they wouldn't be so keen on sinking us, Captain, sir." The captain's expression turned from angry to excited.
"Dorp, that's the first good idea you've ever had. Drag her to the quarterdeck. Hoist her up high if you have to, and let's pray to the moons it gives those Yeldsons pause."
Tress bore the treatment with as much dignity as she could manage. They soon had her standing up on the rim of the quarterdeck, waving for everything she had, hoping that the red coat would persuade them to hold their fire. Unfortunately, the attacking ship either didn't see or didn't care, because the next cannonball hit the quarterdeck bulkhead, smashing through and causing quite a clutter in the captain's cabin. The Sprouter cursed. "What a stupid idea," he snapped, dragging Tress by her collar as he went below decks again to check for more leaks and return her to her cage. Unexpectedly, a second after they reached the hold, the ship lurched. It was so jarring that Tress tripped and fell face first into the dead spores that covered the floor of the hold. She scrambled to her knees and wiped away the spores with frantic hands, panicking. What if a few live ones remained? The Sprouter had let go of her collar. "No," he said, turning to stare up the steps. "No, no, no!" The ship groaned around them, sliding to a halt. Then it fell quiet. Even the footsteps stilled. And it took her a moment to realize what had happened. The seethe, the bubbles that fluidized the spores, had stopped. The ship had essentially run aground on the ocean itself. Until the seethe began again, they'd be trapped, stuck in one place. "No, no, no, no!" the Sprouter cried, forgetting Tress and running up the steps. The reason for his panic occurred to Tress almost immediately. The enemy cannon was already pointed straight at them, and they were no longer moving. A second later, a cannonball blasted through the aft hull, ripping a wide hole. Tress screamed and covered her head as the cannonball soared over her and crashed right through the front of the ship, never shattering as it was supposed to. Tress cowered on the floor, awaiting the next inevitable shot. Then, through the terror, her practicality asserted itself. She turned, shifting wood debris off her back, and looked out through the large new hole in the hull. Across the ocean, at the enemy ship, which was also stuck in place, several 100 feet away. The sea had become, essentially, solid. At least as solid as a sand dune. It was made of deadly spores, but it could be walked on. And while the people on that enemy ship might wish her harm, those on the Oot's Dream most certainly did. It didn't take long for her to make the decision. She threw herself to her feet and pushed past the vine growth in the hold, making for the hole. "Watch out!" the rat said from behind as something dropped on her. The Sprouter, seeing her move, had leaped off the broken steps above to tackle her. "Here now," he said. "That's a right good idea. You're going to give me that coat, and I'm going to go plead for my life with those fellows." He began to rip at her clothing, and she frantically felt around for a weapon. Her fingers latched onto something metal, and she swung it up, clocking the sailor on the head. He dropped like a streaker's trousers. Tress gasped, panting on the floor, then glanced at what she'd grabbed. A pewter cup. Wait, her pewter cup. Huh, she thought. Didn't expect to be right about that. She searched around and spotted her things nearby, along with some other items that had been tossed around in the explosion. Then she cried out as another cannonball hit the ship somewhere above, making men scream. She grabbed her sack, then stumbled over to the rat's cage. "Almost forgot about you," she said. "Sorry." "It's a common human failing," he said. "Don't get me started on the way your people talk about my kind." "Brace yourself," Tress said. "I don't have anything to cut that cage free, so—" She raised her heavy metal cup, then swung it down and broke off the little lock. The rat shoved out with his snout, then leaped onto her arm and climbed up her shoulder. She supposed that, with spores all over the floor, she didn't blame him for getting up high. "The name is—" the rat coughed. "The name is Huck. That'll do, as I don't think my real name will work." Something in rat language that a human couldn't say?
Basically,
he said, as she turned and walked over to the hole in the ship.
You?
Tress, she said.
Well then, Tress, Huck said, you ready to do something absolutely insane?
Such is unfortunately becoming a theme to my life, Tress said, then stepped out onto the spores. 12. The Crow. The spores scrunched under her feet. Tress tried to breathe slowly and shallowly. Even with her shirt once more pulled up over her mouth, she felt exposed. All it would take was a single spore. Another cannonball whooshed overhead, crunching through the ship. However, she walked carefully, slowly, to keep from kicking spores up into the air. Steady and deliberate, that was the way, despite her entire body being taut with anxiety, knowing that at any moment the seethe could start again, and she'd sink to her death.
Now that's a sight,
Huck said softly from her shoulder. Tress risked a glance back. For some reason, a flock of seagulls was beginning to gather around the Oots' dream. Several sailors had been wounded in the most recent shot, and one man had fallen off the side of the ship. He was bleeding. The poor man thrashed and screamed, spraying blood across the spores, which grew in bursts, undulating and latching onto the ship like enormous tentacles from some unseen leviathan. The sailor disappeared in the contorted explosion of vines, but she could hear him screaming in there somewhere as he was crushed, more and more blood leaking out to feed the hungry ocean. Gulls dived at the vines and attacked them with apparent gusto. What was that about? Tress turned forward and continued, step after step, toward the enemy ship. Though it had seemed close from the hold, out here it felt miles away.
I've never done this before,
Huck said from her shoulder.
You know, walked out on it.
Me either, Tress said, trying to prevent herself from hyperventilating. Keep moving forward.
I don't mean to alarm you, Huck said, but the seethe will probably start up again any minute now.
Tress nodded. She knew the basics. There were long stillings now and then, maybe every day or two, when the seethe stopped for several hours. There were times when it would stop for a day or more, though those were rare. Most stillings were only a few minutes long, as if the seethe were some singer deep under the ocean, pausing briefly to draw in another breath. She tried to pick up her pace, but the spores were deceptively difficult to walk on. Her feet slid, and moons above, she hadn't laced her boots tight enough. She could feel spores getting into her shoes, slipping between the fibers of her socks and rubbing against her skin. How much sweat would it take to set one off? Just keep moving, step after step. She heard scrunching noises approaching and glanced behind her. One of the smugglers had seen what she was doing and was running toward the enemy ship. He was kicking up so many spores. She tensed, bracing herself, worried that— Snap! A mess of vines burst from his eyes, and he dropped, writhing, making more grow up around him. Tress kept going, but another sailor passed her, walking with a confident, steady stride, faster than she dared. They were over halfway to the other ship. "Please, Emerald Moon," she prayed. "Please, just a little more time." She could see sailors gathering on the foredeck of the other ship. They'd stopped firing. They didn't need weapons any longer. The smuggler ship cracked and popped in the distance as an overwhelming number of vines grew up on the side where the bleeding sailor had fallen. Tress felt the eyes of the enemy sailors on her. One figure in particular, standing right at the prow of the ship, wearing a hat with a tall black feather, looked ominous. The shadowed figure raised a long musket and aimed straight at Tress. Then the figure turned slightly. The musket shook, and the crack sounded a fraction of a second later. The sailor who had been striding toward the ship in front of Tress dropped, his blood starting another eldritch spire of twisting vines. Tress stopped, then braced herself for a second shot. When it didn't come, she started forward again. It was too late to turn back, and certain death lay that direction anyway. So she pressed forward, feeling an awful tension, like a bowstring being drawn farther and farther and even farther. She kept waiting for that crack, or for the ground to start trembling beneath her feet, or for a spore to slip into her nose or to touch one of her eyes. When she at last reached the shadow of the grounded enemy ship, it felt like she'd been walking for an eternity with a knife right at her throat. Sailors gathered at the ship's rail and stared down at her. She spotted no uniforms, except maybe on that figure in the center. With the black-plumed hat, their face was lost in shadow as the sun shone from near the horizon, silhouetting them. No one said anything. The sailors didn't offer Tress a place on their ship, but they didn't shoot her either. So, lacking any other options, Tress tied her sack of cups to her belt and tried to find a way to climb up. Unfortunately, the keel and hull of the ship were of smooth brown wood, and after a few attempts, Tress knew that scaling it would be impossible.
"I'm sorry," Huck said. "I think I must have been wrong. Those don't look like the king's people up above, Tress. I wish that I—"
Tress gave their situation a moment of thought. Then she wiped her finger to remove any spores before putting it to her mouth. She got some spittle on her fingernail, took a deep breath, and flicked it toward the spores a few feet away. A mid-sized vine tree grew from the spores, curling around itself and reaching into the sky. Tress grabbed it, feeling the rough coils beneath her fingers like rope. Then she climbed.
"That's it,"
Huck said, scrambling off her shoulder and up higher along the vine.
"Come on, Tress. Hurry!"
She did her best, pulling herself up some 10 feet until she could barely reach a porthole on the side of the ship. Huck leaped onto her shoulder again as she grabbed a hold and clung to the hull. She could see the ship's name there, painted in golden letters. The Crow's Song. Up above, some of the sailors were laughing, chatting with a jovial nonchalance about her struggle. Spores streamed from her boots as she hung there, scrabbling for a foothold on a small ledge running along the outside of the ship below the portholes.
"There it is,"
Huck said.
"Listen."
It started as a low humming that vibrated the ship. Moments later, the spores began churning, air rising up through them. The ship lurched, nearly shaking Tress free. Orders above led to unfurled sails. Tress's vine ladder slipped away, sinking into the suddenly fluid ocean. She glanced at the Oot's Dream as it listed to one side, dragged down by the many vines that wrapped it. The entire thing bobbed, then capsized before finally sinking entirely. Vines mushroomed up around the vanishing wreck as men screamed, giving their water to the ocean, and the flock of gulls scattered. Tress's current ship sailed past the wreck, but the Oot's Dream was gone before they arrived. Just 3 lonely crew members remained, 2 on pieces of wreckage, 1 in a small lifeboat. All 3 wore scarves over their mouths, their eyes squeezed shut. 2 shots sounded from the deck, killing the 2 on the wreckage. For some reason, the Crow's Song left the man in the lifeboat alive, the sole remnant of the smuggler crew. An ignoble end to Tress's first voyage. She clung to the hull of the Crow's Song. Her fingers began to burn, her arms to ache. But there were no handholds above, plus the side of the deck and gunwale extended out there. She doubted she had the strength or skill to get up over that, if she could even reach it. So she hung on, tight as she could, as the ship rocked and swayed. Faces periodically appeared above, glancing down to see if she was still there. Then they'd call out to their fellows to relay her status. Still there. Still there.
"Go," she whispered to Huck. "You're a rat. You can climb that." "Doubt it," he said. "You could try. That's a fact. I could."
Together they clung there, for what seemed like an eternity. Finally she started to slip. Her aching muscles screamed, and a rope slapped the wood next to her. She stared at it, numb, wondering if she had the strength to climb it. Instead, she snatched it, hung on, and tucked her head against her arm. Blessedly, the rope began to move, pulled up by several of the sailors above. When she was high enough, an enormous man with his black hair and dreadlocks reached down and grabbed her under her arms, then dumped her onto the deck. The last spores on her clothing died as the silver in this ship's deck killed them.
"Captain Crow said we could pull you up if you lasted 15 minutes, another sailor said, a shorter woman. "Can't believe you did. You're a strong one."
Tress coughed, lying on the deck, her exhausted arms pulled against her. 15 minutes? That had been only 15 minutes? It had felt like hours.
"Not strong," Tress said, hoarse. "Just stubborn."
"That's even better," the sailor said.
Huck wisely kept quiet, though he snapped his teeth at a sailor who tried to grab him.
"What are you?" Tress said to the sailors. "Kingsmen? Privateers?"
"Neither," said another of the sailors. "We'll put up the king's colors soon, but that's a lie. It's our pretty face. Doug's sewing us a proper flag so it'll be ready for next time. Black on red."
Black on red? It was pirates after all. Was that an upgrade or a downgrade from being among smugglers? And why had they sunk that other ship, never asking for loot? A stout figure pushed through the sailors. Captain Crow, judging by the plume in her hat, had harsh lines for a face with tan skin and a scowl deep as the ocean. Crow was, well, I've known a few people like her. She seemed too harsh, too full of anger. She was like the first draft of a human being before softening effects like humor and mercy had been added.
"Throw her overboard," the captain said.
"But you said we could haul her up," said the short woman.
"That I did, and that you did. Now toss her." No one moved to obey. "Look at how scrawny she is," the captain snapped. "An inspector? I've known a few of those. They pick the job for its ease. She'll have never worked a day in her life, and there's no place for anyone without a use on the song." The pirates still appeared reluctant. Why would they care about her? But their hesitance was an opportunity. So Tress, dizzy with exhaustion, pulled herself across the deck and struggled to her knees. She'd spotted a bucket and brush here, and she methodically, as fast as she could make her aching arms work, took out the brush and started scrubbing the deck. Captain Crow eyed her. The only sounds were the seething spores and the brush scraping back and forth. At last, the captain pulled a canteen from her belt and took a long drink. It did look like a nice canteen, with leather up the outsides that had feather patterns imprinted on it. Even when exhausted, Tress appreciated a good drinking vessel. Crow stalked off and gave no further orders to deal with Tress. The pirates retreated to their posts, and no one tossed her. She kept working anyway, scrubbing as Huck whispered encouragement in her ear. She worked well into the night until, numb with fatigue, she finally curled up in one corner of the deck and fell asleep. Part 3. The Cabin Boy. Tress awoke the next day with a face full of hair. She felt stiff, like a wash rag that was long overdue for a turn in the laundry. She unfolded herself from the deck, trying to tie back her hair, and vaguely remembered being kicked during the night and told to move so she wouldn't be underfoot. She'd done it, but had been kicked awake again for the same reason on 2 separate occasions. There didn't appear to be any place on the deck where she wouldn't be underfoot. Her next thought wasn't for food. It wasn't for something to drink or other biological needs. It was for Charlie. Never had Tress felt so naive. She'd thought she could simply leave her home and rescue someone, even though she'd never set foot on a ship before. She felt a fool. Worse, she felt pain for Charlie, who must be somewhere frightened, trapped, and alone. His agony was her agony. It might seem that the person who can feel for others is doomed in life. Isn't one person's pain enough? Why must a person like Tress feel for 2 or more? Yet I found that the people who are the happiest are the ones who learn best how to feel. It takes practice, effort.
And those who, late in life, have been feeling for 2, 3, or 1,000 different people, well, turns out they've had a leg up on everyone else all along. Empathy is an emotional loss leader. It pays for itself eventually. That wasn't of much comfort at the time for Tress, miserable on the deck, realizing that, before she could even think of helping Charlie, she was going to have to find a way to save herself. She huddled against the gunwale and heard someone below decks yelling that first watch could come to mess. Huck whispered something to her and scrambled off to investigate. Tress's grumbling stomach reminded her that the last thing she'd had to eat or drink had been the water that made her see pigeons. So, aching, she climbed to her feet. Mess meant food on a ship, right? Maybe they wouldn't notice if she... A lanky figure in an unbuttoned military coat stepped in front of her. Bald, with scruff on his chin, the fellow wore a sword at his side and had 2 pistols tucked into his belt. Laggart, the cannon master, was the ship's first officer. He had wiry muscles, and that long neck and bald head hinted he might have a buzzard somewhere in his family tree. He looked Tress up and down. "First watch can eat," Laggart said. "Those are the men and women getting ready to take over sailing for the day. Are you going to be working the sails or the rigging today, honey hare?"
"No," Tress whispered.
"Second shift will eat next," Laggart said. "They worked all night and can eat as soon as their replacements arrive."
"And what watch am I?"
Tress asked softly. "Captain says you're third watch," Laggart said, then smiled as he left. Eventually, second watch was called, and the sailors exchanged places. Tress waited, groggy and stiff. And she waited. And waited. One might say she was quite the waitress that morning. Third watch was never called. Tress suspected she was the only one assigned to it. So she did her best to ignore her stomach, instead observing the pirates at work. Maybe if she learned their tasks, she'd be able to anticipate how to keep out of their way. She spent the morning so occupied, and fortunately most of them didn't seem bothered by her. They weren't a jovial crew, but they were apparently a dedicated one. A few times Tress caught Captain Crow watching her from the side while drinking from her canteen. Her glare made Tress feel like a stubborn spot on a window. Best to put herself to work. She rummaged in her sack, checking on her cups, then took out her hairbrush. After beating her hair into submission and locking it away in a braid, she picked up her bucket and floor brush, then realized she didn't have any more water or soap. She stood there looking foolish before someone approached with a fresh bucket for her. She thanked him, then, with a start, realized she recognized him. It was Hoyd, cabin boy of the Whistlebow. There was no mistaking his gangly figure and his pure white head of hair. Though everyone called him boy, he appeared to be in his 30s and evidently of sound mind, until he opened his mouth. "My gums sure do like a lickin'," he said to her, then walked away with a bow-legged gait that made him wobble like a drunk penguin. "Yes, that's me. No, I don't want to talk about it." As I wandered off to go stuff shoelaces up my nose, Tress moved up to the quarterdeck, as it had less traffic. Here she set to work again. Turned out Tress was quite good at scrubbing decks. It was like scrubbing windows, except you didn't need to be able to see through them at the end. In fact, it was too easy, perhaps demeaning of her washing talents, like hiring a world-class surgeon to cut the crust off your sandwich. During her breaks, she watched the crew. She was able to pick out other faces that, like Hoyd, she knew, if only vaguely. Often ships passing the Rock would unload a few crew members. These would get a pass from the inspector and would be hired on by another visiting vessel. This didn't seem to be a notably rough lot. It was a mixed crew, with a variety of ethnicities and nearly as many women as men. That wasn't uncommon in the Spore Seas. You took whoever was willing. Sexism interfered with profits. How had such a normal crew ended up as pirates? And not merely ordinary pirates, bloodthirsty ones who would sink a ship without asking for plunder.
They didn't even cover up the name of their vessel, Tress thought, and they left one sailor alive.
Something was strange about this ship. "I've been wanting to gargle my shirts," I said, walking past. I pointed at her with both hands and winked. "But I ate them last week." Tress cocked her head, watching me wander away. As she did, Huck scampered across the deck and up onto her shoulder.
"What is wrong with that guy?"
the rat asked softly.
"I'm not entirely certain,"
Tress whispered.
"I've met him before, though. He's nice, if weird."
"People who collect stamps are weird, Tress. That man is a few eggs short of a dozen, and he doesn't realize the other 10 he collected are actually rocks."
Sigh. All right, so here's the thing. I'd had an encounter, well, more a collision, with the sorceress a few years before. Let's just say she had something I needed, but liberating it from her proved more difficult than I'd assumed. The end result? The sorceress gave me one of her famous curses. Look, even the most graceful dancer trips once in a while. My curse took away my sense of taste and, well, my other 4 senses as well.
"What did you find out?"
Tress asked the rat. "I snatched some food," Huck said, "but could only get rat-sized portions. Sorry. Also, they really are sewing a pirate flag. I'd guess they're new to this. Maybe that's why they accidentally sank the other ship."
"No,"
Tress whispered, returning to her scrubbing.
"They left one sailor alive on purpose and didn't cover their ship's name. They didn't sink that ship because of inexperience.
They did it to declare themselves," Huck agreed. "The pirate version of sending out a crier to announce a sale at the cobbler's shop. Moon shadows. They killed almost 30 people.
Tress looked up across the crew working at their posts. Earlier she'd read intent and focus in their movements. Now she saw something else. A kind of acute desire to lose themselves in work, perhaps to avoid having to think about what had happened the day before.
"Something is very wrong on this ship,"
she thought again. Unfortunately, before she could think more on that, other matters, of a more scatological nature, demanded her attention. 14. The Dogs. The Crow's Song was a much larger ship than Tress's previous one. Oot's Dream had been a 2-masted vessel, similar to what you might call a brigantine. The Crow's Song was instead a full 4-masted vessel, built for speed but with a spacious cargo hold and multiple decks. It was the equivalent of what you'd call a small galleon, and it had a rather large crew for Tress's world, consisting of 60 people. I'm not going to ask you to remember them all, mostly because I don't remember them all. Therefore, for ease of both narrative and our collective sanity, I'm going to name only the more important members of the Crow's Song. The rest, regardless of gender, I'll call Doug. You'd be surprised how common the name is across worlds. Oh, some spell it D-U-G or D-U-H-G, but it's always around. Regardless of local linguistics, parents eventually start naming their kids Doug, D-O-U-G. I once spent 10 years on a planet where the only sapient life was a group of pancake-like beings that expressed themselves through flatulence. And I kid you not, one was named Doug, though admittedly it had a very distinctive smell attached when the word was spoken. Doug is the naming equivalent to convergent evolution, and once it arrives, it stays. A linguistic great filter, a wake-up call. Once a society reaches peak Doug, it's time for it to go sit in the corner and think about what it has done. Anyway, there was at least one woman actually named Doug on the Crow's Song, but I can't remember which one she was. So, for the purposes of this story, they're all Dougs. Tress approached one and asked, hesitantly, where the toilet was. The Doug pointed her toward the stairs down, explaining that the middle deck head was for low-ranking crew.
With Huck on her shoulder, she began to explore. The ship had 4 levels. The dogs called the top one, which was exposed to the sky, the upper deck. The middle deck contained places like the mess and the armory, and small rooms for officers. The lower deck was a cramped place where most of the sailors made their bunks. Beneath that was the hold, a cavernous space for the copious loot the pirates would surely acquire once they figured out how to stop sinking it all to the bottom of the ocean. There were several toilet rooms with working plumbing, thank the moons. She peeked into an unoccupied one and saw a toilet, but no bath. How did the crew bathe? She desperately wished she could, as she kept finding dead spores in the folds of her clothing. It made her skin writhe to think how much of it must have gotten on her. She did her business in the cramped chamber with only a tiny porthole in the wall for light. Huck politely waited outside without being prompted, proving quite gentlemanly for a rat. Feeling a little better, Tress slipped out and let him hop back onto her shoulder. What did they do with human waste out here on the ocean? Save it all up for composting on islands? What about on long voyages? Dumping it overboard seemed dangerous, not to mention gross. Danger gross? On her way back to the upper deck, she heard a voice coming from a room near the head. She lingered, peeking in to see a man behind a counter, the large man with dreadlocks who had hauled her onto the deck. Now, when I say large, you might have imagined him as heavy-set or perhaps beefy. He was both, yes, but neither word did justice to Fort, the ship's quartermaster. Fort wasn't large like, hey, eat a salad, or even large like, hey, do you play sports? He was large like, hey, how did you get through the door? It wasn't that he was fat, though he did carry a few extra pounds. More, he looked like a person built using a different scale from the rest of humanity. One could imagine that the shards, after creating him, had said, maybe we went a little far in places and decided to cut 10% off all other humans to conserve resources. Fort was holding up a ceramic cannonball that was small in his hands. His fingers on both hands were gnarled, either from some old injury or a congenital disease. The condition had to affect his dexterity. He was with a gangly woman in a vest and trousers, her hair cut very short. Anne, the ship's carpenter, had a nose like a dart and carried not 1, not 2, but 3 pistols strapped to various places on her person. Fort handed Anne the cannonball, and although it looked light in his grip, the way she hefted it indicated otherwise. Then he picked up what appeared to be a wooden sign with a black front, maybe 2 feet across and somewhat less tall. "You examined each one in the armory?" Anne asked. Fort glanced at the back of his wooden board and nodded. "You didn't find any others that were defective?" Anne asked. Fort tapped the back of the wooden sign, and words appeared on the front. "Not a single one," the sign said. "Each one I inspected has a proper fuse timed to explode before it sinks a ship so it can be captured and looted." Anne thumped the ball onto the counter. "Well, if none of the others are defective, we shouldn't have to worry about sinking someone else by accident." Fort again tapped something on the rear of the board using his index knuckle. As he did, the words changed. "I don't like this, Anne. We were supposed to launch cannonballs that only incapacitated the ship, not sink it. I hate that we ended up killing those people, and I really don't like how the captain acted afterward. It doesn't make sense." "What are you saying?" Anne asked. "I'm saying I don't like this at all. It's not the kind of piracy we signed up for." "I don't like it either," Anne said, "but it's too late to change our minds. This is better than getting conscripted, at least." "Is it, though? Is it really? I didn't want those people's deaths on my shoulders, Anne." Anne didn't respond. Finally, she stood up straight and walked toward the door. Tress felt a moment of panic, not wanting to be discovered eavesdropping, and scurried back into the head. Tress listened to Anne leave up the steps outside. "What do you make of that, Huck?" she whispered. "Don't know," he said. "Sounds like they didn't intend to sink the Oot-stream, which makes sense. But after the first cannonball broke through the hull and started the ship going down, the pirates must have decided to finish the job." Tress nodded, although she didn't know what to think about all of this.
They're still culpable, though, Huck added. What did they think would happen, turning pirate and attacking? They can't simply decide to be sad for killing someone after trying to rob them. These pirates are outlaws now, Tress.
Doesn't sound fair, she said. The king would hang the quartermaster, even if he didn't fire the cannon?
The law's clear. Felony murder rule, to be precise. Commit a crime and someone dies? That's murder, even if you weren't intending it. The Royal Navy will be hunting this lot, and we'd best not be on board when they get caught, just in case the officials don't believe you're a captive.
It was a wise suggestion. This ship was a death trap. Either the captain would eventually tire of her, or she'd end up dead in the inevitable fighting. She had a job to do in saving Charlie and couldn't waste time. But how to escape? She couldn't exactly jump overboard. Plus, her dry throat warned her that she had other more immediate concerns. If the captain wouldn't let her eat, she wouldn't live long enough to escape. She snuck over to the quartermaster's room again and glanced in to see that the large man had turned his back toward the door. He was arranging things in his many trunks and boxes behind the counter. Could she steal something to eat? Or perhaps Huck could do it for her? She glanced at him.
"What?"
he asked loudly. Tress glared at him, making a shushing motion.
"I think he's deaf," Huck said. "When I was prowling earlier, I heard someone mention that the quartermaster couldn't hear."
Indeed, Fort continued his work, still facing away from them. He didn't notice them talking.
"I met a deaf human once," Huck said. "She was a dancer, and one of the best under the moons. Best I'd seen, anyway. I was enjoying the time with her, but it ended up getting interrupted in a rather abrupt way. Which is a shame, but things happen. I also couldn't afford to talk to her since, things relating to who and what I am. Didn't want to reveal myself."
"Maybe," Tress suggested, "this would be another good time to not talk, unless you want one of the pirates to realize they have a potentially sellable loquacious rat on board."
"Yeah, good point," he said. "It's just, I spent all those weeks hiding on the smuggler ship before they grabbed me. Got kind of lonely. It's good to have someone to chat with."
She glanced at him.
"Which I'll stop doing now."
Tress moved to leave, but as she did so, one of the boards creaked underfoot. Fort spun immediately in her direction, then narrowed his eyes as he saw her. He might not have been able to hear, but every quartermaster I've ever known has a kind of sixth sense for when people are sneaking around near their goods. Beneath the enormous man's glare, Tress felt like bolting, but he had been the one who'd pulled her up onto the deck. She stood in place instead until he raised his strange board from the counter. "Come here, girl," it read. It wouldn't do any good to run, so, feeling like she was entering the dragon's den, Tress entered the room. 15. The Quartermaster. Fort looked her up and down, rubbing his chin with thick fingers. Finally, he tapped the back of his board and words appeared for her. "You have a name?"
"Tress, sir."
"And are you truly a royal inspector?" Tress swallowed.
"No. The coat doesn't belong to me. I stole it."
"You're a pirate now," Fort wrote. "What you steal is what belongs to you."
"I'm not a pirate,"
she said. "You are so long as you want to keep breathing," Fort wrote. "Don't tell anyone you don't intend to join us. That sort of talk gets a person tossed overboard." Tress nodded.
"Thank you, sir."
"Don't call me sir. I left that title behind a long time ago. My name is Fort. Anyone feed you yet?" In response, her stomach growled. She shook her head. Fort leaned below his counter, then came up with a plate, the thin ceramic edge held between the first two fingers of his hand. Earlier, she'd thought he would lack dexterity due to his fingers, which looked like they'd each been broken in several places, then allowed to heal without splints. Yet he managed quite well. Some actions took more effort, and his hands did tremble, but he was obviously capable, even if he had to do things differently from other people. After placing the plate before her, he pulled out a pot, scraped at the bottom, and slopped some crusty hash browns onto the plate. He followed that with some watery eggs.
Leftovers from breakfast, Tress thought. The dregs the others didn't eat.
She waited, with difficulty, before eating anything. He watched her, then dropped a fork onto the plate. She took this as permission and dug in. It was awful. The overcooked hash browns had the consistency of beetle shells, complementing the eggs, which were reminiscent of what might have been found inside those beetle shells. You didn't have to be a master cook to tell this food was awful, but to someone like Tress, it was worse. Feeding her cold and crusty leftovers, the bits that hadn't gotten any spices on them, was like locking a master pianist in a room by themselves, then piping in off-tune kazoo renditions of great masterpieces. Tress didn't complain. She needed to eat, and she wasn't going to reject the only thing she'd been offered, despite it tasting less like food and more like what food turned into. To take her mind off the meal, Tress nodded to the board that Fort used for communicating.
That's an odd device.
He handed her a cup of water, a nice bronze one that lacked ornamentation but shone when it caught the light. The water, at least, tasted pure and clean. She drank it down eagerly. "It is, isn't it?" Fort wrote. "Your words appear for me on the back as you speak. It can even differentiate voices and puts a mark before them to indicate someone new is talking."
"Wow,"
Tress said. Now, you might be wondering why Fort didn't read lips. I, like many hearing people, once assumed this was the magical solution for people navigating the hearing world. But in case you haven't heard, pun intended, reading lips doesn't work like it does in stories. It's a messy business full of guesswork and is extremely taxing, even for experts. Fort used to rely on it anyway, enduring its low accuracy, until he was able to find his way to this device. It had many functions, including some he didn't know yet. For example, the words would appear larger if he wrote fewer of them, taking up all the space on the board. But when he wrote longer messages, the words shrank to fit more. "It's wonderful," Fort said. "I got it from a wizard a few years ago."
"A wizard?"
Tress said. "From beyond the stars," Fort said. "A very strange fellow. He used it to translate words to our language. I traded hard to get it. It seemed to surprise him when he realized how much it would help. It's hard for me to write the usual way for hearing people since I can't make some of the shapes." That wizard from the stars wasn't me, by the way. I've always wondered who traded the device to Fort. That's Nolthian tech, with awakened predictive connection circuits. Fort turned the board around and showed her the back where he could tap letters and bring down lists of common words. The board anticipated his needs, giving likely options. It worked with supernatural speed, seeming to anticipate his very thoughts. "I have to leave it out in the sun once a week or it stops working," Fort wrote, "and its magic won't respond to anyone other than me, so don't think about stealing it."
"I wouldn't dare," Tress said with a start. "I mean, you've been so kind to me."
"It isn't kindness," Fort wrote. "It's a trade."
"For what?"
"Haven't decided yet," Fort said. "Go back to your food, girl." She did, unfortunately. As she tried valiantly to keep eating, another of the sailors walked in. This was the shorter woman who had stood up to the captain the day before. Her black hair was in tight curls. She strode in and slapped something on the counter, barely giving Tress a glance. How to describe Soleil, the helmswoman? She was the same ethnicity as Fort, and, like him, was from the islands of Lobu in the Sapphire Sea, where the zephyr spores release a burst of air when watered. She had delicate features, but wasn't the least bit fragile. "All right, Fort," she said. "I'll give you 3. She deposited 3 small earrings onto the table. "I told you, Soleil," Fort wrote, "I have no use for earrings. They make my ears itch." "4 then," Soleil said, placing another on the counter. "I won them off a dog at cards, but it's all I have. They're solid gold.
You won't get a better deal anywhere."
At the word deal, Fort perked up visibly. He inspected the earrings.
"Come on, Fort," Saleh said. "I need to get back to duty."
Fort rubbed his chin, then scratched at his dreadlocked head. Then he took something from below the counter and set it out for her. A pocket watch.
"Finally,"
Saleh said, slipping it off the counter and hurrying out. Fort inspected the earrings one at a time, smiling. It was true that he had no use for earrings, but it was a good deal, and good deals to Fort were their own reward. Tress managed to choke down the last of the food. She felt she deserved a medal for that. Fort merely gave her another cup of water, then shooed her away, but not before he wrote, "Come back after everyone else has had supper. Maybe I'll have something for you to eat." Tress nodded in thanks. On her way out, she passed me, skipping a little as I went in to settle on a stool before Fort's counter. The quartermaster brought out some more of the food and gave it to me. "My favorite," I said. "Don't try to eat the plate this time, please," Fort wrote. I dug into the food, humming to myself at the flavor. "What? Yes, I could taste it. Why wouldn't I be able— Oh, the 5 senses? Yes, I said I lost my sense of taste to the sorceress's curse. You thought I meant that sense of taste? Oh, you innocent fool. She took my other sense of taste, the important one. And with it went my sense of humor, my sense of decorum, my sense of purpose, and my sense of self. The last one stung the most, since it appears my sense of self is tied directly to my wit. I mean, it's in the name. As a result, I present you with Hoyd, the cabin boy. Anyway, that rounds out the people you need to remember for now. Captain Crow, First Officer and Cannon Master Laggart, Fort, the quartermaster, Anne, the carpenter, and Saleh, the helmswoman. Everyone else was a Doug, I think. Oh, right. I nearly forgot Ulam. But, seeing as he was dead, he barely counted. 16. The corpse. With her stomach full of food, Tress was able to return to the top deck and resume her scrubbing with renewed vigor. She didn't know how long it had been since someone had properly washed this deck, but it was coated with a layer of dead spores that had turned black with grime. It took real work to get down to the actual wood, and so her progress was slow. "Wow," Huck said from her shoulder, comparing the dark, grimy wood ahead to the vibrant brown planks she'd cleaned, silver lines sparkling between many of them. "That really makes a difference." "Spore scum sticks to basically anything," she said, scrubbing hard. "I've never found a better remedy than soap and effort. This wood is going to need some pitch when I'm done, though." Tress knew quite a lot about sailors for someone who knew next to nothing about sailing. She had listened to many a man or woman complain about the life, which, to hear them talk, was an existence full of drudgery. Many an off-duty sailor in the tavern had been assigned scrubbing duty before, so Tress knew that pitch on the boards would seal them and fill the gaps. Plus, it made them far less slippery. And you always scrubbed across planks, never along them, so you didn't wear grooves down the centers. Her head was full of wisdom like that, the wisdom of complaints. It also taught her the hierarchy of a ship's crew. Most of the sailors would be equals, save for the officers. She'd met all of those except 2, the ship's surgeon and the ship's sprouter. She'd never understood that last term, not until she'd seen the man use the spores on the previous ship. She passed midday and ignored her stomach as it started to growl again. It should have known better after what she'd done to it at breakfast. Fortunately, she found out where to get new water, from barrels in the hold, and she was allowed a cupful to drink each time she went to refill her bucket. Otherwise, she scrubbed. Tragically, this work, like washing windows, was great thinking work, and her mind was, as I believe we've established, often full of thoughts. That is one of the great mistakes people make, assuming that someone who does menial work does not like thinking. Physical labor is great for the mind, as it leaves all kinds of time to consider the world. Other work, like accounting or scribing, demands little of the body, but siphons energy from the mind. If you wish to become a storyteller, here is a hint. Sell your labor, but not your mind. Give me 10 hours a day scrubbing a deck, and oh, the stories I could imagine. Give me 10 hours adding sums, and all you'll have me imagining at the end is a warm bed and a thought-free evening. Tress's mind spun around what the quartermaster had said about the cannonballs. What had gone wrong? She was so intrigued that when she picked her next section to scrub, she placed herself near the forward cannon. Moments later, a Doug called to her. "Hey, you," he said. "New girl. Yes, you. Come on now, I need your help." Concerned, but too polite to object, Tress stowed her bucket and brush. She dusted off her knees, then followed after the Doug as he led her down to the hold. Here he gathered some cannonballs from a bin. "Carry that," he said, pointing to a small keg near the wall. Tress hesitantly picked it up, finding it lighter than she'd expected. "What's this?" she asked. "Zephyr spores," the man said, "from the Sapphire Sea." She nearly dropped the keg in shock. Spores? An entire keg of them? She could see why he'd demanded her help. Indeed, he eagerly chose to carry the much heavier cannonballs, leaving her the task of lugging the spores. "Why," she said, "do we have a small keg of spores?" "For firing the cannons," the Doug explained. "Can't just drop a cannonball in. You need something to go poof, send the ball flying." Spores? They used spores to fire the cannons? She carried the keg more gingerly as they started up the steps. "Normally," the Doug said, "this'll be old Weave's job, seeing as how it involves spores and all." "Weave? Is he the ship's sprouter?" "He was." The Doug's expression fell. "Nice fellow. Liked having him around. He was terrible at bluffing, you know, so I always beat him at cards." "What happened?" "Didn't want to become a pirate." "So he got off at port?"
"Oh, he got off," the Doug said, "but there wasn't no port."
He glanced toward Captain Crow, who stood on the quarterdeck sipping at her canteen, wind blowing the black feather in her hat. "Captain killed him?" Tress whispered.
"He was the only one who stood up to her," the Doug said, "when she proposed this new occupational direction. Well, Weave is occupying the bottom of the ocean now. Sprouters are a crazy lot, always spending more time than's right around spores. But he didn't deserve that. Just for asking questions we was all thinking."
He fell silent. At least she now knew why she hadn't met the ship's sprouter yet. And now you know why I didn't tell you to remember his name. Also, no, he's not the corpse. Well, he's a corpse, but he's not the corpse on the ship. There's another. Try to keep up. The Doug led Tress to the cannonmaster's station. Laggart wasn't there at the moment, and the forecannon was lashed in place with its paraphernalia. The Doug began unloading cannonballs into a bin. "All right," he said to Tress. "I'm going to go get a few more cannonballs to refill the stock. See that big barrel there? It's lined, like that keg you're holding, with stuff that protects spores from our silver. We need spores alive for shooting cannonballs at other folks. The cannonmaster, though, he needs those spores in little pouches he can stuff into the cannon easily during a fight. You'll find empty pouches in the barrel. What you need to do is pour those spores into the pouches without spilling any and tie them off. Also, you got to do your pouring inside the larger barrel because of the lining that protects the spores." The Doug shifted uncomfortably on the deck, his hands in his pockets, looking at her. "Very well," Tress said. "No complaints?" he asked. She shook her head. She'd rather not do the work, as she was terrified of spores, but she also couldn't let that fear inconvenience the others. After all, she was newest on the ship, It made sense that she should do the dangerous work no one else wanted. Tress moved over to the barrel and took off the lid. At the bottom were some filled pouches. A bunch of empty ones were in a little net attached to the outside. "You're really not going to complain?" the dog asked. "I complained when they made me do it."
"You're probably smarter than I am," Tress said. "Any tips?"
"There's a funnel, some goggles, and a mask. Other than that, try not to worry. This ain't the most dangerous type of spores. You should be fine." Many perils could fit between the sounds in should be, but Tress was alive because the crew had resisted tossing her overboard when the captain had demanded. It seemed best to stay in their good graces. So Tress simply nodded and got to work. 17. The Carpenter. The blue spores fascinated Tress. They were the first spores from another moon, another sea, that she'd seen up close. They were beautiful, almost crystalline. The fact that they could likely kill her with ease only made them more captivating. Like an expertly forged sword crafted with love, dedication, and sweat by a smith, so that someday you could do the most ugly things possible in the most beautiful of ways. She sent Huck away with a quiet word to not put him in danger. Then she whispered a prayer to the moons and thought of Charlie. Getting the crew to trust her was the best way to further her goal of reaching him. Doing the work they didn't want to do themselves was bound to lead her toward opportunities. Even washing windows had led her to opportunities, the most important one being when she met Charlie in the first place. All that in mind, and with the mask over her mouth and the goggles over her eyes, she felt only slightly terrified as she lowered the small keg into the larger barrel. There were hooks on the side where she could affix it, and the spigot at the bottom of the keg, like for pouring beer, let the spores drain out at a careful rate. Her hand still shook as she held the funnel and filled up the first pouch with the radiant blue spores. She tied it and set it carefully on the bottom of the barrel near the other pouches. She fell into a rhythm filling them, taking care not to spill a single spore. It was tense work, far worse for thinking than cleaning the deck. But Tress, being Tress, couldn't avoid thoughts entirely. She wondered exactly what the spores did that made the cannon fire. She wondered if there were other types of spores being carried in the ship's armory, and who managed them if the crew's sprouter was dead. Also, she wondered why the large barrel had a false bottom. She recognized it easily. After all, she'd spent several weeks becoming an expert on barrel contraptions and how to hide things in them. On one of the devices she'd prepared for leaving the rock, they'd installed a secret latch hidden right about there. She found it near the barrel's banding, a little piece of metal she could wiggle. When she moved it, a hole, little larger than a fist, opened in the bottom of the barrel. A few pouches of spores dropped in, and her breath caught. When she reached in to pull them out, her fingers brushed something else. A cannonball, hidden in the cavity beneath the barrel's false bottom. There was room for 3 or 4 of them inside. She quickly pulled the pouches out and reset the device. As she returned to her work, her hands trembled even more. Her mind raced so fast it would soon need a new set of tires. She could see it. She knew what had happened. The cannon master was in charge of loading, aiming, and firing the weapon. He'd be given a rack of cannonballs, but who would be watching to see if he grabbed one from this secret compartment instead? Probably no one. She bet those hidden cannonballs wouldn't pass Fort's inspection. They wouldn't be rigged to incapacitate the target with vines. Laggert, the cannon master, had deliberately sunk that other ship. But why? The entire situation didn't make sense for a multitude of reasons. It wasn't just the lack of plunder. Why bother hiding the fact that they were going to sink the ship? Why the subterfuge? It only made sense if— "So, Zephyr spore duty," a voice said behind Tress. "I wondered who the dogs would force to do it, now that Weave is dead." Tress turned to see the lanky, sharp-nosed woman with the short hair who had been talking to Fort earlier. Anne, the ship's carpenter. Every ship needs a good carpenter. Oh, a sprouter can patch up a hull with a quick burst of spores, but silver erodes even fully hardened roseite over time. Doesn't take a man long at sea to start contemplating how thin the barrier is between him and certain death. Just a plank. If you ever want to have a good face-to-face with your mortality, you'll find the opportunity on the deck of a ship at night, staring at the endless darkness beyond you, when you realize the darkness beneath is somehow even more heavy, more vast, and more terrifying. That's when you realize that having a good carpenter on board is worth paying them a double share of wages. In fact, it's quite the steal.
"I don't mind the duty," Tress said, making another pouch. "I'd do it again if they asked."
Inwardly, she was uneasy with how Anne walked next to the cannon, trailing her fingers on the metal. She'd been talking to Ford about the cannonballs. What side was she on? How many sides were there? What had Tress gotten herself into? Sadly, she didn't know the half of it yet. "Don't say things like that, Tress," Anne said. "Sailors don't volunteer for duty. It's downright untraditional."
"You know my name?"
Tress said. "Things get around on a ship," Anne replied. "I'm Anne, ship's carpenter, assistant cannonmaster." Assistant to Laggart. Tress licked her lips, nervous, then stopped. Licking anything was not a good idea when handling spores. She made another pouch. Had Anne seen her find the hidden chamber? "What do you think?" Anne said, settling on a box nearby, a hand on one of her pistols, as if taking comfort in it. "You're a pirate now, Tress. An unexpected sideways turn in life."
"Better than an unexpected turn downward," Tress said.
"Aye," Anne said, "that it is."
Tress wanted to ask more questions, but it felt like too much of an imposition. These people had spared her. Who was she to be making demands of them? So instead she said, "You all seem to be adjusting well to being pirates."
"Adjusting well? What kind of talk is that?" Anne leaned forward. "You want to know why, don't you? How we ended up this way?"
Yes, Miss Anne, I do."
"Why not ask?"
"I didn't want to be impolite."
"Impolite? To pirates?" Tress blushed. "I don't mind talking about it," Anne said, staring out over the sea. Before them, the ship's prow cut a path through the spores. "The captain spun it well. We could either end up fighting in the King's common war, or we could strike out on our own, throwing away all the laws about writs and tariffs. Plus, the captain said, we'd be doing a noble and important duty."
"Important?" Tress asked.
"A vital part of the economy."
I see."
"Do ya?"
"Actually, no," Tress admitted.
"Then why not say so, girl?" Anne said, shaking her head. "Anyway, our job is important. You know how rich folk are. They make all this money off people sailing around, selling and buying for them. Then what are they going to do with the money? Lock it away. What good is locked away money? Ain't nobody going to enjoy it if it's trapped in a vault with Granny's wedding ring.
So we've got to take some, inject it back into the economy as a stimulus, to help local merchants, the small folk who are just trying to live. We do an important service."
"By stealing?" "Damn right." Anne sat back, shifting her hand on her pistol. "Least that's what it was supposed to be like. We weren't supposed to be dead runners. I guess we all knew the risk. Didn't expect to fail so hard in our first act of piracy, though." Tress cocked her head, barely resisting the urge to scratch at the place where the goggles met her face. Despite the silver on the deck, spores on her fingers could live long enough to do damage.
"I'm confused," Tress said. "Dead runner?"
"You don't know?" Anne said. "What kind of sailor are you?"
"The kind that
doesn't know what a dead runner is? She felt profoundly annoyed at being berated for withholding questions, then being mocked when she didn't. "There are two varieties of pirates, Triss," Anne explained. "There's the ordinary kind. Then there's the dead runners. Regular pirates rob, but don't kill unless they're fired upon. You sail well enough to catch the ship you're chasing, and they surrender their ransom price. Then they sail away with their lives while you sail away richer. That's how it's supposed to work. It becomes a contest, see? A race with a little extortion to keep it interesting. The king's marshals, they keep records. So long as you let folks go, so long as you don't murder crews. Well, if you get caught, they lock you up. But they don't hang you."
"That sounds remarkably civilized," Tress said.
Anne shrugged. "Civilization exists because everyone wants to keep their innards in her innards. You don't punch a fellow when you first meet him because you don't want to get punched each time you meet someone. The king knows this. So long as he gives pirates a reason not to go all the way, they'll hedge. Besides, who wouldn't rather have a chase than a battle? The poor sods on merchant ships don't want to lose their lives over their master's money. The masters don't want their ships being scuttled or stolen. And you don't last long as a pirate if'n you gotta wipe the deck with your blood every haul. Except, if you kill someone by accident."
"Or an entire ship's worth of people,"
Tress said. Anne nodded. "Then you become a dead runner. No mercy for you if caught. Even other pirates will hate you. Nobody will take crew from a dead runner ship. You're left to make your way, lonely as the single bean in a poor man's soup." By the moons, it made sense. Tress revised her opinion of Anne. That forlorn expression, that regret, it meant whatever conspiracy there had been to sink the smuggler's ship, Anne hadn't been part of it. Laggart had been, though, and likely the captain. They'd wanted to become dead runners, hence the hidden cannonballs, the sinking of the Oot's Dream. Why else would the captain leave one of the sailors alive to spread the word? Tress was so absorbed by these thoughts that she forgot herself and absently scratched at the itch by her goggles. She froze as she was doing it. Moon shadows. Well, at least, that was when Tress's face exploded. 18. The Other Corpse. Tress found herself lying on the deck, the goggles blown free of her face. What was that sound? Screams of pain? No, laughter. Anne was laughing uproariously. Tress immediately put her hand up to her cheek. It was sore, but fortuitously still attached to her face. She'd gotten a mote or two of zephyr spores under the rim of her goggles, where they had touched a bead of sweat. Mercifully, that tiny amount of spores didn't pack enough of a punch to kill her. "It isn't funny," Tress said, sitting up. She was right. It was hilarious. "Come on, spore girl," Anne said, helping Tress up by the arm. "Let's have the surgeon look you over." She shouted toward the dog who had made Tress do this work and told him to clean up. Then Anne helped the disoriented Tress down to the middle deck. "You really work with that stuff?" Tress asked Anne. "As assistant cannon master?" "Well, when they let me," Anne said. "Why don't the cannons explode?" "They do. That's what makes the cannonballs shoot out." Tress determined to give that some thought later, as it didn't make sense yet. Washing windows, it should be noted, is not an occupation that offers a thorough education in ballistics. Over from the mess, near the prow, was a door that had been closed when Tress had investigated earlier. Now Anne pushed it open and steered Tress inside. There she found a man dressed in a sharp suit of a cut she'd never before seen. It was somehow less ostentatious but more elegant than the uniforms the Duke and Charlie had worn. Pure black, with pressed lines and no buttons on the front. He had jet-black hair and features that looked too sharp to be real, like he was a painting or a drawing. His skin was an ashen gray, his eyes blood red. If the underworld had legal counsel, it would have been this man. Tress should have been frightened of him, but instead she was awed. What was a creature like this doing on a pirate ship? Surely this was a divine being from beyond space, time, and reality. In a way, Tress was correct. And no, he still hasn't given me my suit back.
"My," Dr. Ulam said with a refined but excitable voice, "what have you brought me, Anne? Fresh meat?"
She was loading the Zephyr pouches, Anne explained, leading Tress to a seat at the side of the small chamber, and some got underneath her goggles.
"Poor child," Ulam said. "New to the ship, You have very nice eyes."
"If he asks to buy them," Anne whispered, "haggle. You can usually get double his first offer." "My eyes?" Tress said, her voice rising. "He wants to take my eyes?"
"After you are dead, naturally," Ulam said.
This room was filled with cabinets and drawers. He unlatched one and took out a small jar of salve, then turned toward her.
"Unless you'd rather do it now, I have several fine replacements I could offer. No? What about just one?"
What are you?" Tress asked.
"He's our zombie," Anne said. "Such a crude term," Ulam replied, "and not terribly accurate, as I've told you."
"You ain't got a heartbeat," Anne said, "and your skin is cold as a wet fish."
"Both adaptations reduce my required caloric intake," Ulam said. "My method is efficient. I think everyone will be going around without a heart once I solve the problem of how lacking one kills humans."
He offered Tress the salve.
"Put this on your skin, child, and it will help with the pain."
Tress accepted it and timidly put a dab on her finger.
"She took it easily," Ulam said. "Is she brave or stupid?"
"We haven't figured out yet," Anne said. "I gather this must be some kind of hazing," Tress said, "from the way Anne keeps grinning. So I might as well get it over with. If any of you wanted me dead, I'm as good as tossed overboard anyway."
"Ooh," Ulam said. "I like her. I'm going to have to keep an eye on you, girl. Here, hold this."
He dropped something into her other hand. It was a human eye. She squealed and dropped it, though Ulam caught it with a quick snatch.
"Be careful. It's one of my favorites. Observe the deep blue coloring. It would look wonderful exchanged for your left eye. You'd be heterochromatic, blue and green. Quite striking."
No, thank you?"
"Ah, well," Ulam said, putting the eye away. "Perhaps another time. Use the salve. There is no prank involved. I'm probably the least dangerous thing on this ship."
"You literally eat people, Ulam," Anne said.
"Dead ones? My, how dangerous! Like the mighty worm of the earth or the bacteria of decomposition. They are my colleagues."
Hesitant, Tress touched the salve to her cheek. The pain vanished immediately. Startled by the efficacy, she rubbed it around her cheek. When Ulam held up a hand mirror, her skin wasn't even red, and there was no sign of a wound. "There's a reason we keep him around," Anne said, "even if he's weird as a two-headed snake."
"As the only true source of modern medicine in this backwater land," he said, "I find your vivid simile inaccurate. Incomplete axial bifurcation is far more likely in reptiles than other animals, so if you wish to call me odd, pick a two-headed bird or a mammal for full effect."
Both women stared at him, trying to parse that sentence.
"I've eaten several two-headed snakes," Ulam noted, "and mimicked their forms, So rather than being as odd as one, I've literally been one. Alas, I couldn't divide my consciousness and think twice as quickly. Wouldn't that have been fun? He took the salve back from Tress. Anyway, try to avoid blowing yourself up in the future, It mangles the corpse and gives it a metallic taste.
If you're wondering, I have it on good authority that Ulam was enjoying himself during my regrettable period of indisposition. He made no move to break my curse, and instead wrote some extremely embarrassing accounts of my actions and sent them to several good friends of ours. Granted, the rules of the curse prevented me from giving any direct explanations of how to break it, but I really expected more from him. As it stands, after coming to find me and then discovering my ailment, he'd just taken up residence on the ship. He'd always fancied becoming an explorer. "For the sense of adventure, he'd said. The crew hadn't known what to make of him at first. Captain Crow shot him a few times, an experience he reports as being invigorating. Members of his species are virtually impossible to kill. Other than the eating corpses part, they can be handy to have around, as the crew soon discovered. From then on, they simply dealt with him, rather like a rash that occasionally rescues one from life-threatening wounds. He didn't ask for payment, aside from the occasional otherwise useless corpse. It's gruesome, yes, but you'll find you're able to put up with quite a bit of eccentricity in a person who can literally work miracles on your behalf. Tress, understandably left numb by her first interaction with the ship's surgeon, was deposited on the deck near her bucket and brush. Anne went off to do some other work, so Tress, prodding at her completely healed cheek, decided to go back to scrubbing. She hadn't made much progress before Huck came scampering up.
"Something's happening."
"What?" Tress asked. "An attack?"
No. See, you sent me away, so I figured I'd go sneak some food. I'd already eaten, but you never can have too much, right? I was down in the hold where, I'll have you know, there's nothing really accessible without nibbling through sacks, and people hate when we nibble through sacks. If they hate it so much, why not leave them untied for us? Then no sacks are harmed, you see, and—
"What did you want to tell me, Huck?" Tress asked. "What's happening?"
Right. I was getting to that. Laggert was down there looking through the storage, and Tress, he fetched a couple of cannonballs. I saw him sneak them into his pack."
Interesting. It was time to test her theory. She positioned herself to scrub near the forward cannon station, not too close, but close enough to watch. Then she became a waitress again for a short while, watching for Laggert. It didn't take long. 19. The Cannon Master. Laggert swooped over to the cannon and craned his long neck over the barrel, eyeing the bundles of spores. He eventually declared the work well done, praising the dogs. At that moment they discovered the wonders of outsourcing, the luxury of taking all the credit, doing none of the work, yet reserving someone to blame just in case. Tress didn't mind. She'd rather not have Laggert paying attention to her. The dogs hopped off to other duties, and Laggert made quite the show of cleaning the cannon himself, something he never left to another's care. Tress scrubbed the deck nearby, invisible in plain sight. Whenever Laggert turned her way, her head was inconspicuously down in her work. Yet she watched closely and spotted it as he stealthily took a fist-sized cannonball from his pack and hid it in the false bottom of the barrel. She had been right. He kept rigged cannonballs in the hidden compartment, cannonballs designed to sink ships. But why? It was so much more dangerous to be dead runners, and it denied them loot. Wasn't that the one essential thing that defined pirates? Other than, the boats and stuff. He wanted the crew to become dead runners, against their wishes or knowledge. Laggert finished his work, shouted at a few nearby dogs for being lazy, then hauled his pack to his shoulder. He strutted off toward the captain's cabin, where Crow let him in and posted a sailor at the door before closing it. The heavyset Doug didn't look much like a guard, but the way he lingered reminded Tress of how Brick's cousin stood watch by the tavern door on nights when people were expected to get rowdy.
"I need to know what they're talking about in there," Tress said. "Yeah, that would be great, wouldn't it?" Huck said from her shoulder. "I'll bet it's very secretive." "I need someone to slip in," Tress said. "Maybe we could ask one of the Dougs?" Huck said. "Someone," Tress said, "who is small, quick, and who won't be noticed listening." "Dang," Huck said. "Don't know if the Dougs will be sneaky enough. Have you heard the way they tromp around on the deck? I was trying to sleep last night, and I'd swear they have lead in their shoes.
He trailed off, noticing her glaring at him.
"Oh, rat. Right. Got it."
He hopped off her shoulder and scuttled over to the gunwale, then scrambled along it in the shadows over to the captain's cabin. The Doug watching didn't notice as Huck slipped along a small ledge on the outside of the ship and went in the captain's window. Perhaps you're wondering why Huck had so quickly fallen in with Tress. Well, there are a lot of things I could tell you here, but suffice it to say that in the short life of Huck the Rat, every human he'd met had tried to kill, capture, or sell him. Every human but Tress. He didn't know a lot about people, having spent most of his life isolated, but he did like Tress. He would rather she not die. So, spying it was. Tress began scrubbing furiously to work out her anxiety. Minutes passed with the weight of hours as she worried about sending Huck into danger to satisfy her curiosity. That wasn't something she would normally have done. Life as a pirate was already affecting her. Yet Charlie was out there somewhere, afraid, hurting. She had to find a way to escape, then continue her quest. So maybe learning to impose on people a little was all right.
"Hey," Huck said, scampering across the railing next to her. "You got anything to eat? Spying is hungry work."
Tress glared at him as her stomach growled.
"Just asking," Huck said. "Moons, girl, no need to look at me like I ate the center of the loaf and left you the heels." "Did you hear anything?" she asked.
Huck twitched his nose in a way he seemed to think she would understand. Then he hopped down and scurried over to a more sheltered section of the deck. She followed, her back to the Dougs. To anyone watching, she'd simply be doing her thing, scrubbing away. They wouldn't be able to see Huck.
"All right," the Rat said from the deck in front of her. "I'll tell you what they said. Let me get into character."
"Character?" Tress said. Huck went up on his hind legs, holding his little ratty paws before himself with his nose up in the air.
"I am Captain Crow,"
he said in a surprisingly good approximation of her aristocratic accent.
"Hip hop, do as I say. My, this canteen water is tasty. Laggart, what news of the cannon? Is everything ready?"
Tress waited, her head cocked.
"You be Laggart," Huck hissed. "I wasn't there. I don't know what he said." "You'll do fine."
Huck waved his paw at her.
"Go ahead, be Laggart."
The cannons are ready?"
"Voice needs more crust to it," Huck whispered, "and stretch out your neck like his. It will help you get in character." "But—" "Excellent, Laggart," Huck said in his captain voice. "But I have unfortunate news via Raven from my contact in Kingsport. The remnants of the ship we sank have been found, but there were no survivors, just a single corpse. That man we left alive appears to have rejected my bountiful generosity and done me the insult of dying from wounds we didn't realize he had." "She said that?" Tress whispered. "Those exact words?" "It's a dramatic recreation," Huck hissed. "What, you think I wrote it down? With these?" He waved his paws at her. "That's as close as I can remember. Now do Laggart's part." That's sad," Tress said. "Tress, that's not what he said. He said, 'All that work for nothing? We'll have to sink another then.'" He waved a paw for her to continue. Tress sighed. "All that work for nothing? We'll have to sink another then." Moon shadows, could you put less emotion into it? Huck said. I feel like you're not taking your role seriously. I don't—
This is a problem, Laggart, Huck said in his captain voice, falling to all fours and stalking back and forth with his nose in the air. The crew is upset. I'm worried about some of them running off.
But why? Tress said. We're getting there, Huck said.
Look, why don't just I do Laggart's part too? You take a break.
Memorize your lines next time, all right?
But— Huck stretched out his neck and spoke with a creepy, scratchy voice. As well you should, Captain, he said. Fort is brewing trouble, and maybe Soleil, too. We need blood binding them to this ship if we're going to do what you want. Huck moved over to be the captain again, standing up on his hind legs with his front paws on the gunwale, as if mimicking the captain gazing out the window. The crew will never follow us to dangerous seas unless they have no other choice, unless they're desperate. We will sink another ship, Laggart, and leave a couple sailors alive this time. Huck turned to her and settled into a more rat-like posture. And that's it.
Dangerous seas, Tress whispered.
The Verdant Sea was one of the safer ones, but apparently Captain Crow wanted to leave such spores and head toward a place the crew wouldn't go unless they had no other choice.
So, what do you think? Huck asked.
She's got some kind of special curse for the crew, eh? Blood binding them to the ship?
No curse,
Tress whispered, continuing to scrub so she wouldn't appear suspicious.
But Laggart said— It was a metaphor, Huck, Tress said. Don't you see? The captain isn't certain of her crew's loyalty. She wants to sail dangerous seas, but is worried they'll desert her if she tries to make them do that. So she turns them to piracy, then accidentally sinks a few ships, Huck said, making them into dead runners. Chased by the law, ostracized by other pirates, they'll have no choice but to follow her orders.
Huck twitched his nose, which seemed to be his version of nodding in agreement.
I can see that. Yeah, you're probably right. You look morose, though. Not morose, Tress said. Merely distracted. Why? Because, she said, I've just figured out a way for us to escape this ship.
20. The Helmswoman. Captain Crow soon emerged from her cabin, leaving Laggart to strut across to the bow while she climbed up to the quarterdeck. Tress went down to refill her bucket and left Huck to forage for some more food. Returning to the upper deck gave her an excuse to reset her location, so she moved to the quarterdeck, near where the captain stood next to Soleil, the helmswoman who had traded Fort those earrings earlier. Tress didn't want to act suspicious, so she didn't execute her plan at first. She scrubbed, feeling the boat rock upon the spores, listening to the dogs calling to each other and the planks creaking. There's a certain freedom to the sounds of a ship at sea, a feeling of motion, of going somewhere. On an ocean, even a spore ocean, so long as the seethe holds up, it's hard to sit still. You're either bending the waves and wind to your will, or you're being bent to theirs. Usually it's a careful grapple between the two. As Tress stood up to stretch, she gazed across the vibrant green sea. It was odd because the moon was in the wrong place. Always before, it had been almost overhead, but they'd sailed far enough that it was several degrees lower. She couldn't help but remark upon the sea's beauty. Spores, vibrant in the sunlight, shimmered as they seethed, an endless expanse of lush death waiting to explode with life. Like with the zephyr spores earlier, this beauty transfixed her. Our minds want dangerous things to be ugly, yet Tress found those rolling waves inviting. In the moment, she imagined those rippling spores upon her skin, but rather than cringing, she was curious. Danger doesn't make a thing less beautiful. In fact, there's a magnifying influence, like how a candle seems brightest on the darkest night. Deadly beauty is the starkest variety, and you will never find a murderess more intoxicating, more entrancing than the sea. "North," the captain said, holding up a compass. "North, Soleil, toward the 7 Straits." "Into the shipping lanes?" Soleil asked. "Best place to find our next target," the captain said, tucking away her compass. Tress sensed her opportunity. She settled down, scrubbing hard, then muttered, "You'll kill more, will you?" She heard the captain shift behind her. Tress kept her head lowered. After a moment, though, she muttered, "They were good people you killed. Poor Kaplan, and Marple, and Mallory, fed to the spores." The deck creaked as Captain Crow stepped over. This was a dangerous ploy, but, well, Tress was surrounded by pirates sailing the Spore Sea. She hadn't grown up knowing danger, but they were quickly becoming acquainted. "You muttering something, girl?" Crow asked. "Ungrateful, maybe, for the kindness this here crew showed you?" Tress froze as if frightened and dropped her brush as she looked up. "Captain, I didn't know you— Are you ungrateful?" Crow asked. "I appreciate my life," Tress whispered, her eyes down. But that ship carried my family, Captain. I loved them." "You're a royal inspector. Why were you traveling with your family?" Tress scoffed. "An inspector left this coat at a tavern we stopped by, and I started wearing it because it made my family laugh. And now they're all dead." She let it linger. Then she glanced up and saw thoughtfulness on the captain's expression. Understanding. No, you didn't kill everyone on the Oot Stream, Tress thought. You left one alive, and if she were to escape, then tell everyone how the Crow's song killed her family. The captain turned toward Soleil and unscrewed her canteen. According to what Tress had overheard from the crew, it was common water, which explained why the woman wasn't drunk all the time. "Changed my mind, helmswoman," Crow said, then took a drink. "Take us east, toward Shimmer Bay. We should restock on water." "If you say so, Captain," Soleil said. "I thought we had enough, though." "Never can have enough water," the captain said. "Can't let my canteen go dry, can we? Besides, we've got rats on board. Need to pick up a ship's cat." Quick as that, Soleil called orders to the crew in the rigging and spun the ship's wheel, and they turned toward freedom. Tress felt a surge of excitement. Now, most people would agree that humans are not telepathic. We can't directly send our thoughts or emotions into the minds of others. Nevertheless, you can hear my story and imagine the things I describe, the same as I picture them in my own mind. What is that, if not a form of telepathy? Beyond that, there are those among us who have the uncanny ability to read another's emotions, not through magic or mystical connection or any such figgle-de-grack. No, they are simply students of human nature. They can pick up on people's moods through subtle cues of body language, in the way their eyes move, the way their muscles twitch. Some of these are doctors, interested in healing the mind. Others find their way to the clergy in search of ways to help the human soul. Then there are the ones like Captain Crow, for whom their ability to read others provides a different kind of advantage. That moment on the deck, a part of Crow's mind picked up that Tress was excited, that Tress was happy the ship had turned toward Shimmer Bay. Crow wasn't conscious of what she knew or how she knew it, but, like one might feel an oncoming bout of indigestion, she knew that she wasn't pleased and that Tress was the reason. If you want to ruin Captain Crow's day, point out that she made someone happy. If you want to ruin her entire week, point out that she did it by accident. Crow didn't reconsider her decision to sail for the port. She wasn't the type to second-guess herself. Instead, Crow just pulled her foot back and planted a solid, bebooted kick right in Tress's stomach. The unexpected blow left Tress groaning, tears leaking from her eyes as she curled up in a puddle of soapy water. Crow sauntered off, whistling casually and screwing closed the top on her canteen. She was, it might be noted, a perfect example of why the word jerk needs so many off-color synonyms. One could exhaust all available options, invent a few apt new ones, and still not be able to completely describe her. Truly an inspiration to the vulgar poet. Soleil, now, she was another story. People considered the short helmswoman stern, but she'd been on the business end of a few unearned kicks herself. After barely a moment of thought, she locked the ship's wheel in place, something she wasn't supposed to do save for emergencies, and stepped over to check on Tress.
"Hey,"
Soleil said softly, rolling Tress to her side.
"Let me feel at it. If you've cracked a rib, we'll want to take you to visit the ship's surgeon."
"No,"
Tress said.
"He wants to cut pieces of me off."
"Nonsense. Ulam wouldn't hurt a dove."
"He wouldn't?"
"Nope. They don't have hands he can embalm."
She winked at Tress, who, after a moment, managed to grin despite the pain. Soleil prodded at Tress's lower ribs and listened to Tress explain what hurt and what didn't. That persuaded both that the kick hadn't broken anything other than Tress's mood, so Soleil returned to her post and unlocked the wheel. She continued to watch Tress sitting in a morose lump on the deck. Eventually Soleil called, "You ever worked the ship's wheel before?" Tress hesitantly stood and looked over at her questioningly. Soleil stepped back and gestured to the wheel. "Now, I know that on your planet, steering a ship isn't that big a deal. In many places, they'll hand the ship's wheel to any kid with a standard number of fingers and a habit of leaving at least one out of their nose for extended stretches of time. But on the Spore Seas, they treat it differently. Guiding the ship is a privilege, and the helmsperson is an officer tasked with a serious duty. So even if Tress had often been on ships, as she'd been pretending, it was likely she wouldn't ever have taken the wheel." Awed, she stepped over, double-checking with Soleil before fixing her hands on the wheel in the positions the helmswoman indicated.
"Good,"
Soleil said.
"Now, hold it firm. You feel those vibrations? That's the seethe shaking the rudder. You need to be careful to not let that shake the entire ship. Hold the wheel firm, and take any movement slowly and smoothly."
"And if the seethe stops?" Tress asked.
"Turn the wheel to straighten out the rudder, so the spores don't rip it free. But again, you need to be careful. A sudden motion from the helmswoman can send sailors tumbling from the rigging."
Tress nodded, wondering if maybe it wasn't the best idea to entrust such an important duty to her. Soleil, however, was a little like Captain Crow, in that she was the opposite of the captain, in the way that only someone very similar could be. Soleil also had an instinct for what people were feeling, and she'd noted Tress's dedication to her scrubbing. A woman who did such a simple duty with exactness, well, in Soleil's experience, that sort of thing scaled upward. Same way you would be more likely to lend your best flute to someone who treated their own battered one with respect. Tress held firmly to the wheel, feeling the chaotic churn of the spores beneath travel up the tiller ropes, through the wood, and into her arms. She felt a deeper connection to the sea when standing there, and, if not a power over it, an ability to ride it. There was strength in being the one who steers. It was a freedom she had never before known, and had never before realized she needed. One of the great tragedies of life is knowing how many people in the world are made to soar, paint, sing, or steer, except they never get the chance to find out. Whenever one does discover a moment of joy, beauty enters the world. Human beings, we can't create energy. We can only harness it. We can't create matter. We can only shape it. We can't even create life. We can only nurture it. But we can create light. This is one of the ways. The effervescence of purpose discovered. Then Tress saw the captain stalking across the deck, and the pain in her stomach, including some not directly caused by the kick, returned.
"Won't the captain be mad if she sees me up here?"
"She might," Soleil said. "She couldn't do anything about it, though. Traditions as old as the seas say the helmsperson decides who steers the ship. Not even Crow would dare imply otherwise. If I wanted, I could keep the wheel from her."
As if to prove her point, Soleil showed Tress the ship's compass and sky chart, both kept in a cabinet next to the helm. She had Tress correct the ship's course by a few degrees, taking them to the east of a group of large rocks jutting from the ocean ahead.
"It's the helmswoman's job," Soleil said, her expression distant, "to protect the ship. Keep a steady hand, steer clear of danger, out of storms, away from spore explosions. Keep them safe, somehow."
Tress followed Soleil's gaze. She was staring down at Captain Crow.
"She is pushing the crew,"
Tress said, cautiously choosing her words,
"to go further than they want."
"We all decided this together," Soleil said. "We're responsible for our actions."
"She's more reckless than the rest of you," Tress said.
Tress almost explained what she'd discovered about the captain and Laggert, but thought better of it. Making such an accusation didn't seem prudent. She barely knew Soleil or anyone else on this crew.
"Crow is a harsh one," Soleil said. "That's true. That might be what this crew needs, though, now that we're dead runners."
Those were Soleil's words, at least. The way she glared at the captain wasn't so respectful.
"I don't understand why you've all done this," Tress said softly. "Becoming what you have."
"It's a fair question," Soleil replied. "I guess we all have our own reasons. For me, it was either this or give up sailing. Maybe I should have done that. It's just, there's something about standing on a ship, holding the wheel, something special." Moons, I sound like a lunatic talking like that.
"No," Tress said. "I understand."
Soleil regarded her, then nodded.
"Anyway, I have someone to find out here on these seas. Sooner or later I'll sail into a port and discover my father is there. I can pay his debts and bring him home. Surely it's the next port."
She lifted her compass, then stared off toward the horizon. Tress felt a sudden stab of shame, though she couldn't place the reason. Yes, she understood something in Soleil's voice, that longing for someone in trouble, that determination to do something about it since no one else would. But there was no reason to feel ashamed of... The wheel lurched in her hands, and the entire ship began to shake. Tress gripped tight, then, terrified she'd drop the sailors from the rigging, eased the wheel to the right, straightening the rudder. The crow's song stopped quivering, and, as Tress fought the wheel, slowly glided to a halt. The seethe had stilled. Sweating, gasping, Tress looked to Soleil. The helmswoman, ever stoic, merely nodded.
"That could have been worse," she said.
Then, noticing how the sudden halt had panicked Tress, she added,
"Maybe go take a rest."
21. The Pirate. Laggert called for the afternoon watch to go for dinner while they waited out the stilling. Not wanting to draw the captain's ire any further, Tress returned to her work, scrubbing while everyone else relaxed. As always, she spent the time thinking. I would call the gift of thoughtfulness a double-edged sword, but I've always found that metaphor lacking. The vast majority of swords have two edges, and I've not found them to be any more likely to cut their owner than the single-edged variety. It is the sharpness of the wielder, and not the sharpness of the sword, that foreshadows mishap. Tress's mind was sharp as a sword, which in this moment was unfortunate. because while she'd identified a path to freedom, she couldn't help listening in as Anne leaned against the mast nearby and spoke to Laggart. "The one who loaded spores for your cannon?" Anne said, thumbing over her shoulder at Tress. "It wasn't the dogs. It was her. Thought you should know."
"Please don't stick up for me," Tress thought, feeling another stab of guilt. "Please don't remind me how nice you are."
Night fell, and the seethe began again, sending the ship back on course toward its port. Tress tried to scrub away her frustration, but guilt does not clean as easily as spore scum, and soon I came ambling up to her.
"Your coat is nice," I whispered to her, "but it would look better if you painted half of it orange."
"Orange?" Tress said. "That sounds like it would clash."
"Clashing is good fashion. Trust me. Oh, Fort says to go see him for food."
I winked.
"I need to go nibble on my toes for a bit. They taste like fate."
Tress tried to ignore the offer, but soon Huck came bouncing up to her.
"Hey, you hungry? I'm hungry. We gonna go try to get some food or what?"
With a sigh, Tress let him climb onto her shoulder, then trudged down to the quartermaster's office. There, by the light of a small lantern, Fort handed her another plate of food. It didn't taste quite so offensive as last time, but perhaps that was because so many of her taste buds had committed ritual suicide following the apocalyptic breakfast. Tress sat on a stool in front of Fort, who insisted, via his incredible writing board, that he wasn't doing her a favor, and this was merely a trade. Tress saw through it. She saw it in the way he refilled her cup, the same bronze one she had used earlier, when it got low, and how he had saved her a bit of cake for dessert. It was awful, old and crusty like the rest, but the thought meant something.
Moons, it hurt.
Not the food. Her own betrayal. She'd known these people only a day, but she still smiled when Ulam sauntered in and haggled for the gull bones from dinner, which Fort had saved for him. It was not the haggling itself that she smiled at, but the fond way the two sported during it. This ship was a family, a doomed family, led by a mother who didn't care for them. Tress had to do something.
"Fort,"
she said, looking down at her plate and pushing around the last bit of what she hoped was gull meat,
"I don't think Captain Crow has the crew's best interests at heart."
Fort froze, holding a cup he'd been polishing. A nice pewter mug with delightful nicks along the rim from repeated use. Tress didn't know if it was from the 7th century Horgswallow tradition or simply a close copy, but it was an excellent specimen.
I listened in on her," Tress said. "When she and Laggart—"
"That's enough," Fort wrote. "Anything more will get you tossed overboard, Tress. No speaking mutiny."
"But, Fort," she said, lowering her voice, "you were worried about the cannonballs, and I discovered—"
He slapped the counter to cut her off. Then he very deliberately wrote in large letters, "No more."
Moon shadows. He looked terrified, broken fingers trembling as he tapped on his board.
"Captain visited, asked why I was being so nosy. Shouldn't have said anything. Don't you say anything. It's too dangerous. She's too dangerous." He erased those words quickly, glancing toward the door, sweating as he shook the board and made certain nothing incriminating remained. "Finish your food," Fort wrote.
"Why are you all so scared of her?" Tress said. "She's just one person."
Fort's eyes widened. "You don't know," he wrote. "Of course you don't. And I won't say, not my place. But she could kill every one of us, Tress. Easy as that. So keep your tongue and let it drop." He punctuated that by putting the board down and turning away from her. So much for warning the crew about the captain's plans. She forced herself to eat her last bite of the meal, then slipped out of the quartermaster's office. She lethargically walked back onto the upper deck, her belly full, her feet feeling like they were chained.
"Moons," Huck whispered from her shoulder. "We need to get away from here before the place turns nasty. How are we going to escape? You never told me."
In response, Tress raised a finger and pointed. The verdant moon dumped spores far in the distance, but was close enough to illuminate the deck with a green glow. Ahead of the ship, lights dappled a large shadow. Land, and the port city of Shimmer Bay. Freedom.
"I could sneak away no problem," Huck said, "but they'll be watching you. Captain will set guards, Tress. They won't let you go."
But they will," she said, sick. The captain ordered the crew to quarters for the night, saying they were making a quick stop and anyone who tried to sneak off would be flogged. Then she set Laggart on watch. But Tress slept on the deck as she had the night before, and with no sailing to be done, there was no one to trip over her. Around midnight, Laggart wandered off to use the privy. He made certain to clomp loudly on the steps to wake Tress, who wasn't asleep, though she appreciated the gesture. She stood up, quietly gathered up her sack of cups, then crossed the empty deck.
"Huh,"
Huck said.
"If they didn't want anyone getting off, why did they run a gangplank down to the dock?"
"Because," Tress whispered, standing there,
"Crow wants me to spread the story of the Oot's dream sinking. Remember, the captain wants this crew to be dead runners. If I am allowed to slip away, she presumes I'll tell everyone. Then the crew will be trapped beneath the captain's will. They're too afraid of her to mutiny, and as long as they're too frightened of the law to escape, they'll have to do what she says. Sail dangerous spores essentially as her slaves." "Poor lunatics," Huck said. "Well, let's get away before we end up like them."
Tress hesitated at the top of the gangplank. Shimmer Bay was a good distance from Kingsport, but she could make her way there, continue her plan of figuring out what the sorceress wanted for Charlie, then find a way to free him.
"Tress," Huck said, "I can't help noticing that you aren't moving." "I should stay," she whispered, "and help the crew." "What?" Huck exclaimed. "No, you shouldn't." "They've been so kind to me. You barely even met them. You don't owe them anything." "I saved you when I'd barely met you," Tress said. "I didn't owe you anything." "Well, I mean—" The rat rubbed his paws. "Yeah, but, well, huh."
She didn't know if she could rescue Charlie. She wanted to so badly, but his pain, though poignant to her, wasn't something she could immediately prevent. The people of this crew were different. "Maybe if I can help the crew," Tress said, "they'll take me to the Midnight Sea to get Charlie." "They're pirates." "They're a family," Tress said. A plan started to form, a way she could stop Crow in secret. "And Huck, I need to do what I can. For them." Decision made, a weight came off her. She wasn't abandoning Charlie, but this was something she needed to do. "Oh, boy," Huck said as Tress turned around and walked back to her sleeping spot. "You should run," Tress said to him. "Get away. I won't blame you, Huck. It's the smart thing to do." He clicked his teeth together, and she thought maybe that was a ratty version of a shrug. "I have a good feeling about you," he said. "But, I mean, are you sure about this?" "Of course I'm not," Tress thought. "I haven't been sure of anything since I left the rock." Something flared in the night. A match. Tress felt a spike of alarm as she saw the light illuminate a figure sitting on the steps up to the quarterdeck. Captain Crow, her face outlined in orange as she lit her pipe. Had she seen? Had she heard Tress talking to Huck? The captain puffed on her pipe and waved out the match, plunging her face into darkness, backlit by the bright moon-filled sky. "Captain?" Tress asked. "You should run, girl," Crow said. "You've proven yourself these last 2 days, and I judge you worthy of life. So go ahead. Slip away into the night." Tress took a deep breath. "I want to join your crew." "Join us," Crow laughed. "Just earlier today you were cursing us for having killed your family." "I lied, Captain. I wanted to make you feel sorry for me so you'd take pity and feed me.
I know you saw through that. Your kick proved it. I shouldn't have lied.
Then that wasn't your family on the ship?
I was a stowaway, Tress said. Didn't belong there any more than I belong in Shimmer Bay. I think I might belong here.
Crow didn't reply at first. She unscrewed the top of her canteen, a rattling sound in the night. Tress thought she could track the captain's thoughts. If Tress hadn't lost anyone, if she wasn't angry at the crew... Captain Crow stood up, a shadow in the night. "Run along anyway. No place for you here. We don't need you scrubbing the deck all day underfoot. I saved that job for punishment, and with you doing it, you've taken away one of my tools for ship discipline. Everyone on this ship must have a place, and you have none. Unless you'd like to take the role of our anchor." Crow turned toward her cabin, smoke drifting up from her pipe. Tress nearly ran off as she'd been told. And yet... A piece of her hated being bullied, hated it enough to overcome her reluctance to impose. She'd hated how the Duke bullied Charlie. She'd hated how the inspectors bullied the dock workers. And she hated it more here, facing down a woman who thought she could do whatever she wanted to whomever she wanted.
"You don't have a ship's sprouter,"
Tress said. Captain Crow froze at the door to her cabin.
"He's dead," Tress continued. "You need someone for the job, but the Dugs won't do it. Otherwise you'd have pressed one of them into it by now. They made me fill the Zephyr pouches. They're frightened of spores."
"And you aren't?" Crow asked from the darkness.
"Of course I am," Tress said. "But I figure a healthy respect for them helps a sprouter stay alive."
Silence. Crow was a shadow in the night, watching her, judging her, smoke puffing up into the emerald sky. "Aye," Crow said. "You're right on that. Suppose maybe there is a place for you here. You did cross the spores on foot, took a Zephyr explosion to the face. Still willing to work with spores, eh? Yes, indeed, I could make use of you. In fact, I might have the perfect place for you."
Tress frowned to herself. Were they participating in the same conversation?
"Welcome to the Crow's song, then, ship's sprouter," the captain said, pushing into her cabin. "You'll forfeit your share of loot from our first 3 plunders, but can take an officer's portion after that. Also, you can't eat with the others. Go to fort for leftovers. Sprouters are a strange lot, and I don't want you getting spores into the food."
Yes, Captain."
"And don't lie to me again, or we'll be finding out what happens to a human when they swallow a pouch of Zephyr spores. Dr. Ulam has always wondered." Crow raised her canteen to her lips as she shut her cabin door. Knees soft as lard, Tress flopped down on the deck, then pulled her red inspector's coat tight. She was terrified by what she'd done, but determined. She knew it was right. She felt it. For better or worse, Tress was a pirate now.